Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time to join us at Ocean Burn for a conversation about the microplastics and its effect on the human species, on the human health system with regards to the nanoplastics in the brain, the microplastics in the reproductive organs, the just all the stuff that people are reading, all these scientific articles about. They're sharing them with each other, but every time a paper comes out, then another paper comes out to refute it, and the public is confused, right? They don't know what to believe. They don't know what is the actual data of what this problem is, right? Think about when I talk to people about organizing Ocean Burn for the last year, everyone's like, oh yeah, that's great, but I don't eat fish, so the microplastics are not my problem. Right? It's like I'm a strict carnivore, so it's not my problem. This connection between just like every way that we interact with food, the way that we buy the food, the way that we package the food, the way that we store the food, even the way that we heat up the food, and dispose of the food. Every single part of the food process is touching plastic. And people don't, so there were even some people that didn't know that plastic was made from the runoff of oil. The entire plastic industry is a byproduct of humanity's obsession with the capturing of the energy of oil, the power that it brings, the economic wealth that it brings, right? And so, the reason why I'm so grateful to have Tina Woods, the executive director of the International Institute of Longevity, and the amazing Tina Technotic, DJ extraordinaire of the Longevity Rave, be hosting this is in the joy of acceptance in the Buddhist sense. You look at the situation with no despair, no hope, and essentially no projection of how you would want the situation to be. Because everyone hears about the 5 to 10 grams of nanoplastic in the brain, and they're like, oh well, I probably only have 5 grams. And it hasn't become sort of personally connective with everybody in the larger cultural zeitgeist. And I guess the purpose of this conversation is talk to the people that are closest to the data, to talk to the people that are closest to the information that's not being filtered through the journalist that's writing about it, that's trying to get views, or the advertisers that are trying to sell you the microplastic blood testing kit that no one knows if it works. And so this conversation is really an invitation to be very dramatic, grounded in data. Right? Don't sugarcoat the situation for the people. Right? Really, really talk about even the things that we don't know from observation, but the things that could be true from the observations that we've made. Right? The fact that we know that microplastics are creating endocrine disruption, and all of the things that the endocrine system relates to in the human body, from emotional behavior to digestive health to the decision of where you want to live and how you want to live your life. Like all these things, the anxiety and the depression and the PTSD and the addiction that our current society is dealing with in the wake of COVID is exacerbated by the endocrine disruption that continues to increase as the microplastic concentration in your system continues on. So with that, I would like to allow Tina to take the floor and give an introduction to each of our panelists. Thank you all so much for joining, and I will let the geniuses speak.
Well, thank you so much, Charles, and thank you for the opportunity to actually have the stage to actually present some of the evidence and the data that is around, that is starting to emerge, because, and like you said, it's really, really important for the general public to have access to the facts as they are emerging. And I think that's the point, is that they are fast emerging, and it's a very fast-moving kind of environment at the moment in terms of the microplastics situation. So we have the next sort of hour of conversation with some of the experts behind the evidence, and who are also out there actually measuring sort of the impact of what we call exposomic factors on our health. So before I introduce our experts, just a quick word on that. So Tina Woods, I've been very, very actively involved in really generating awareness around the importance of understanding what is called the Human Exposome. So some of the people who will be watching this may have heard of the Human Genome Project, which was a colossal sort of multi-government, multinational effort to basically, decode our DNA. And what we have found more than anything as a result of this exercise is that actually genetics are only a relatively small proportion of the determinants of our health. And I think this has brought on, a new, growing recognition that we actually need to really understand what actually affects our biology, affects our epigenetics, how we express our genes, because as we get more and more information about this, we realize that actually it is the major driver of our health. So the human exposome, which effectively it's essentially the totality of exposures that we experience over our lifetime. So it's everything from psychosocial stress to levels of activity to the food that we eat, to the air that we breathe. And of course now, microplastics that are starting to infiltrate our tissues, for example, these are all stresses and factors that are actually really starting to be understood to affect dramatically human health. So this is an opportunity to kind of look at the evidence, and I'm really really why it's so important, actually how it's really intertwined with planetary health. So really the root causes of poor health and our climate change crisis, for example, and the situation that we find with our oceans is all linked up. The root causes, but also the solutions. So this is, again, a whole new way of thinking about this. So this is what we're going to explore over the next, 4 hours of different talks and sessions and show and tell. And the first hour is really going to be about, what is the hard-hitting evidence that we really should look at. So I was privileged, along with many people on this call and soon to be joining later, to have a paper published in Nature Medicine a couple of weeks ago now on why we need the Human Exposome Project, a generation on from the Human Genome Project, and really how this lays the groundwork for this whole new frontier of understanding human health, but also how people, how our health trajectory is impacted by all these factors and is linked to the whole aging process and longevity or health span, for example. So this came out, and we're really, really privileged, and I'm going to hand over the floor initially to the editor who was supportive and of this paper, Ben Johnson, who is now, I think, has just taken on the senior chief editor role of Nature Health. So I'm just going to hand over the floor to Ben first, and likewise around the circle, as it were, to all the other experts. I think two of whom are contributing co-authors to the paper, which is fantastic, and give their perspective. And I've got a number of questions that I'll ask, but I'll let everyone sort of introduce themselves first before I go into the overall question. So Ben, introduce yourself and sort of, some of your perspectives on this.
Sure, thanks, Tina. So, as you say, I'm an editor at Nature Medicine and have been for the past 4 years. This is one of the venues which is publishing research on human health in general, including the exposome, including recently the effect of the possible effects of microplastics on human health. As you say, I've just started a new role, so we're launching a new Nature title. So Nature itself is over 175 years old, and this is our new commitment to looking at human health called Nature Health. One of the reasons we've launched this journal is very relevant to our discussion, because it's quite clear that good health requires more than medicine. So medicine is necessary but not sufficient for good human health, because if you're trying to, for example, remove microplastics from people's diet, there's not a lot that a medical doctor can do to do that. You need to tackle food packaging, you need to tackle the water industry, you need to tackle societal issues, cultural issues. You need to involve economists, you need to involve engineers, architects, people in industry, and social scientists are really key, behavioural scientists. And that's not just true of microplastics, which is one particular topic, but it's true of most of the biggest factors that affect human health. We published a study in Nature Medicine this week on healthy aging. This is over 100,000 people, and it shows that 9 out of 10 people in the US in this cohort fail to achieve healthy aging, which essentially means at age 70 they have one or more chronic health conditions. And so what is it that makes that 1 in 10, that 10% special? It's diet, right? So it's actually something very kind of feels overly simplistic. If you go to your doctor with a health condition, you don't want them to tell you, you need to eat more healthily. We all know we need to eat more healthily. The number one factor is don't smoke. Number 2 is diet. And then you've got a whole bunch of things like exercise. And as you say, these are more important than your genetics in terms of your impact on lifelong health and well-being. And again, they're things which it's really difficult for medicine to fix. And this, we don't need more evidence in a sense on what's necessary for a long and healthy life. The evidence is all there. What we need is more research on how do you persuade people, how do you change people's behaviour, how do you tackle these societal, cultural issues. So that's what we're going to be publishing at Nature Health, and that's the topic that we're going to be discussing today. So we're delighted to join the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ben. And yes, it's obviously so timely that Nature Health is coming out for all the reasons that you say. So that's fantastic. So I'm going to move on to introduce Paul Shields, who of course is a co-author on the paper. So Paul, I know you and I have been very involved in exposome and aging. And over to you, a little bit of context and background and your perspective on all this before we go into the questions. Yeah.
Paul, you're on mute, I think.
Or we could go to...
Hello.
Oh, there is he.
Okay.
There he is.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, good. So I'm a professor of neuroscience in the city of Glasgow in the UK. I've been working in aging for around 40 years. And what a lot of people forget is that in this city, we have the biggest health disparity, an age-related health disparity in the developed world. It's around 30 years difference between those who live under deprived socioeconomic conditions versus the affluent in the city. We have, on average, the worst life expectancy for a male at birth in one end of the city, and then we have the best in the developed world, 12 miles away. So my research has been a top-down approach to understand what environmental and life course exposures accelerate aging among our most deprived. So that has allowed me to really champion the concept of the exposome of aging, looking at factors such as diet, exposures to toxins, psychosocial stresses, and other biopsychosocial effects that drive the aging process. I synergize and empathize a lot with what Ben was talking about. I think we're now reaching a stage where we are re-envisioning the old Hippocratic concept of medicine, which is essentially giving people sufficient nourishment of the right quantity and quality, tied with exercise and doing everything in moderation, as the best way to good health. And that obviously entails providing the right environment for them to live in. This also has a knock-on effect into less developed parts of the planet, especially in the face of climate change, and again, environmental insults such as microplastics arriving in greater quantities, and they're tied to changes in climate, where we're seeing an epidemic of chronic kidney disease, both in humans and in domestic livestock. These are all tractable problems that do not necessarily need a standard pharmacological or medical model to address. I think we have a much more holistic understanding of our health and how we age in relation to that. And what I'm trying to do is really have a more grounded and holistic approach to understanding how we can improve the years of healthy living or health span for most of our population that does not necessarily require, a magic bullet or a pill or a polypill. So that's kind of me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. So I'm going to move, if that's okay, to Pete, because I know you're also one of the co-authors of the paper, and you are very much at the cutting edge in terms of, the real people in terms of the work that you're doing. So over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Tina. Hey, everybody. Great to hear from Ben and Paul as well already. A lot of resonance there. So I guess starting from a personal story, I grew up with my mum and dad getting sick, whether it be mental health through bipolar disorder on my mum's side, and smoking, which led to her having COPD and passing away, and my dad having a stroke in his early 60s, and then being in a nursing home for the remaining years of his life before passing as well. And in both cases, it was, very much realizing that their situations were very much lifestyle and environmental induced. That made me very health conscious, and like it would, many of us have either a health event that happens to us directly or indirectly that makes us more attuned to this. And then when it became apparent to me through my co-founder, Michael Gear, who also had a loved one who had late-stage breast cancer and felt very helpless to help that person, it was like, what can we do to prevent or help people not get sick way before their time? And he went down the rabbit hole of going to the US, hanging out with people like George Church and Aubrey de Grey, Kristen Fortney, and learning that there was this body of science, that people were working on that was better than curing cancer. It was stopping people getting sick in the first place, aka aging, this loss of function that happens in the body. And the fact that we could now use modern technology and diagnostic approaches to measure that loss of function, what we now know as our biological age. And of course, this biological age concept is just another way of trying to give an easy way for humans to understand their health and their risk of disease and death. And I think this is one of the things that we are trying to champion. And we've done our own work in that regard. We started, my background is in consumer tech, so me and my co-founder had built platforms outside of health that reached 1 billion people and changed behaviors using technology in dating, social, travel, consumer VPN services, and we wanted to apply that into this field of health and well-being. And so we learned, a huge amount at the beginning by building a direct-to-consumer app, which has really digitized this ability to measure health through your phone and your wearables. But we realized there was also some limiting factors there. It wasn't capturing every aspect of health. Also, not everyone trusts digital data on its own. And so our journey has taken us, interestingly, to go more towards the diagnostics, where we're now looking at blood markers, genetic markers, as well as your movement and heart rate data from your smartphone and wearables. And working with institutions like Imperial College and UCL, we were able to approach the problem in a very different way to how a lot of the people in the longevity field are approaching it, which is bottom up instead of top down. And that is to kind of build on what Ben was saying and Paul as well, in what you're looking at from all these different environmental factors. It's like the data out there exists, but it's sparse and varied. How do we take these disparate bits of data and use the latest technologies like AI and data imputation to predict your health in a meaningful way without necessarily having all the gaps filled in? And that insight led us to creating these models that can measure your health very accurately with very little data. So in our case, we built a model which is actually published in Nature Comms Bio that only requires 4 markers and can predict it 11% more accurately than, say, PhenoAge, which was the gold standard in blood aging. And so that insight has led us to go on to think, well, what else can we predict without having the data? And so we're now in the process of building an open, large biological model, which will essentially be able to predict, for example, what your cholesterol is without knowing what your cholesterol is, and perhaps what effect microplastics is having based on your geolocation, for example, or where you live. So all of these things are possible with disparate, sparse, and varied data sets. And I think AI is going to help us really understand how to make sense of the world in this way. And moreover, I think because we have this ability to give a feedback loop to the societies, not just to the wealthy, privileged few, but we can really start working with the health systems and the big lab groups and the health providers and the corporate wellness providers and so on, and even enable the end users to get this insight for free. I think that's where you catalyze engagement to change. When people start realizing that they're aging, for example, 3 years older than they thought they were, you know, that starts to become meaningful for them to say, I don't want that. I want to, you know, live healthier for longer. How do I change that? And I think that's one of the ways in which we can catalyze change. And then, of course, having things like our app and other tools to be a companion in that journey, so that when you then do something like, for example, improve your diet, what effect is that having on my health? How is my biological age getting better?
Fantastic, Pete. And I know I've got a few other questions about what you're actually capturing on the Humanity app, which I myself use and has certainly influenced my behavior. But we'll come on to that a bit later in the conversation. So on to Rachel now. It's so great to have Rachel here because, of course, air quality, and I had no idea how important the quality of your air is on our health until I actually started speaking to Rachel and actually really digging into the evidence. So really pleased that Rachel's here and she can speak to really how important and all the work that she's doing in air quality. And of course, microplastics is in the air as well. And interestingly, Pete touched a lot around behavior. Now, of course, with the right technologies, we can actually have environments where we don't actually have to think about it at all. That will actually be much better for our health. So over to you, Rachel.
Hi, everybody. So great to be with you today. So I'm on behalf of DALOS and the International Wellbeing Institute. So we are the world's leader in indoor health. That is everything inside your four walls and a door that surround you, whether you're in your boat, like many people are today, or you're in your apartment, your house, your work, your office place, a hospital. In the built environment, we look at what affects your health. So this is all of the aspects of the building and what makes that building healthy. So we're talking about air quality for sure, water quality, which everyone's already touched on, especially in regard to microplastics. And then, of course, we do look at thermal and acoustic, which are very, very important, especially in the work environment. But yeah, touching on air quality and what so many people said about behavior changes. And I think we all have a personal story about health. What's really, really awesome about the built environment, just like Tina said, first, we have to make sure there are no harmful contaminants we're unaware of. You can be a marathon runner. You can have the best heart rate ever. You can have the perfect genomics. You can be striving ahead on all your longevity practices and all your biohacking. But if you have mold, for example, in your home and you're breathing it on a daily basis, you absolutely have a system that is fighting against your health. And it doesn't matter what you do. If your home is sick, you are sick. So we're seeing this in the public space. I'm so excited to be with you all. I do get a little too excited about the indoor environment because we spend 90% of our time indoors. So the single best way to influence health for the world moving forward is to make sure all of our homes and spaces are healthy. And we have all the technology to do it today. We're already certified in 5 billion square feet globally. We have a lot more to go, but we're really excited to be here, a part of the revolution, and to do the exciting work here with Tina. So honored to work with you, Tina, on our projects and to be here today. So
thank you so much, Rachel, and likewise, it's great to be working with you because you are such a leader in the forefront of all this this air quality and technology that we now have at our fingertips. I mean, this is the point, isn't it? We have all this incredible technology,
yes.
And what's hampering progress is lots of different barriers that have nothing to do with technology or even indeed money necessarily. So it is about how we're thinking, and I think, and so that I'm going to open up the first question actually around this because, which really is why has the time come to really look at what we're calling the Human Exposome? Now, there's obviously a lot of general awareness raising we need to do to really explain what the Human Exposome is and why it's so important, and why it's linked to our health and our sort of longevity and indeed our planetary health, etc. So I'm just going to hand over, and this is all part of a massive system change effort that is needed to really change all the incentives, the reasons why we do things the way that we do. And of course, a lot of it is about behavior. So I'm going to open up the question, maybe start with Ben first, who, is at the command and control center of all the evidence. Really, the evidence is pretty clear, around the exposome. If you look at all the exposome factors, can you say, it is really time to take stock of the evidence that is literally there at the moment. There are some gaps, but just perhaps you could kick off that point just to say why the time has come. We must get to grips with it and listen to the evidence.
I think that's right, and in a sense, the exposome is the kind of a modern term for something that everybody understood very well. Particularly if you include diet as one of the exposures, people would be aware of certain toxins and pollutants, the whole field of environmental health. So, the concept that, it goes throughout human culture. If you think about, you are what you eat. For example, the idea of nature versus nurture, and this is kind of the nurture side of it in a sense. It's in many ways it's an instinctive understanding that our environment affects our health, and the evidence is increasingly clear, and I think the large studies that have been done on hundreds of thousands of people, as I say, are showing very clearly smoking, as I say, number one, diet, number two, and of course other things like exercise, environmental pollutants. And, I think in a way the time is now that those very large studies are easier to do than they were in the past. If you take something like wearable technology, it does allow you to do very, very large trials, very, very large longitudinal studies. But again, a lot of the data on health effects of exposures are pretty old. The key study on smoking was in the 1950s, showing that doctors who smoked were more likely to have lung cancer than doctors that didn't smoke. Now that's 70 years old. So I think the challenge is not with the data. The data is really, it is growing for sure. And there is more and more data, particularly around some newer exposures. So plastic would be a good example, where plastics have only really been in widespread use since about the 1950s. You may remember you wouldn't remember Bakelite. I remember vaguely Bakelite. That was 1907. So before any of our times, but really mass use was only since the 1950s. So we do have these new exposures, and I think obviously some of them are growing. We have climate change, we have increase in forest fires, in some cases increase in contaminants. And if you just take a couple of examples, take smoking. It was many hundreds of years after, obviously, indigenous communities in the Americas have been smoking for thousands of years, but it was hundreds of years after smoking was being used in Europe that the negative health effects were really conclusively shown. If you take asbestos, a really harmful kind of workplace toxin, that was being used very widespread before the data was clear. And actually, the only way that you reduce exposure to these, as I said at the start, is through whole of society approaches. So I would argue the challenge is in how do we take action. The data is very clear.
Yeah. So it's a matter of us basically taking stock and actually having asking the right questions, on the basis of what the data is showing us. So fascinating. Thank you. So I think, so if I could ask Paul the same question, because I think, for example, you mentioned, Ben, you mentioned smoking, which we know is obviously a very, very, heavy drag on human health. But they also talk about things like, for example, loneliness, social isolation is having similarly drastic impacts on human health. In fact, there's a smoking, and they say that social loneliness is actually even a bigger killer than smoking, for example. And we have a massive problem in the world about with loneliness, social isolation, et cetera, et cetera. These are all the psychosocial stresses that, of course, are incredibly important to recognize. So, Paul, I'm just going to maybe hand over to you, because I know that's a big area that you've been looking at, and I've got some questions on the foodome, et cetera, a bit later on. But how do you see that, and in the context also of the aging research that that I know you have been, very much driving with your research.
Not sure if he's there.
Oh, is he not there? Oh, there he is. Paul, can you hear us? I'll turn to Pete then. I'll come back to Paul. So Pete, just in the same, so I think, what's really interesting about the work that you're doing with humanity is that you are actually capturing a wide range of actually, big exposome factors. And actually, one of the things that I found really interesting is that you do measure how people are feeling. How are you feeling today? And I've always, I'm so interested in this whole topic. I mean, we can measure stress, but on the converse is more difficult sometimes to even imagine, measuring, for example, joy, happiness, these sorts of things. These are all the big questions that are coming up in some of the discussions I'm having. But how, just a word to that in terms of how you see the work that you're doing as being really important in the field of human exposome research and where you see the future potentially.
Sure. Yeah, and I can touch on why the time is now as well as it links to that. I mean, I think that the stuff we capture in the app is just, if we work backwards, why are we capturing things like your mood and how long your fasting window is and eating snacks in between meals and so on? It's because if you look at the longitudinal data and you see what actually has a health span effect, a lot of the things that you're being sold in the marketplace that are longevity benefits have no data in the longitudinal sense that they increase health span. They are exciting or novel or, could boost energy or make people feel good and so on. But if you look at it from a health span effect, there's nothing that really shows up yet. Things like NAD, there's no human trials that show that this increases health span yet, as a case in point. So all the things that we have in there are things that have had in the research field some data that show it has an effect. And interestingly, it's not what your mood is so much as just the fact that you're checking in with yourself to see how you're feeling. And of course, you touched on loneliness, and the Harvard study, which is probably the largest longitudinal study, which is intergenerational, that showed both for those who are in Ivy Leagues and those who went to community college, the fact that the quantity and quality of your social relationships had the biggest effect on your longevity in the end. But I think, again, that's something that is very situational to when you get old, because I think you are in the last years of life and you are then feeling socially isolated. I think it has a much more detrimental effect than when you're younger. So I think all these things are in context. What I would say about, why I think now is a time and Ben touched on this with, we now have access to all this data from wearables and so on, is that I think that, even if we don't have all the data, the fact that we have systems like what the AI models are enabling us to do means that we can start interpreting the data in a much more predictive fashion. Yeah. And in fact, smoking is an interesting one because it took in some ways so long for them to work out cause because there was a philosophy in statistics that was there was no such thing as cause in statistics, just correlation. And so it was like a dirty word to say, well, that causes this. It's like, well, that could have been anything that caused that. And so there was a body of work that was done in the 80s, 90s, and is much more established now called causal inference, where it actually does draw a line between this as a cause of that. And mathematically speaking, you can show that like quite effectively now. So I think, again, a lot of these principles have kind of fed into AI modeling and machine learning and data science approaches. And so we are simply just taking that to the next level in what we're doing. So if you like, the app was our way to almost our own trial with a few 100,000 people to see what effect does capturing this information have. And what we learned from that is a couple of things. One is, actually the biggest thing that drive change was not the fact that you're making it easy for them to say what they're doing and actually whether the thing itself is having an effect. It's the fact that by making it easy for you to monitor whether what you're doing is having an effect, had the biggest effect. So to put that another way, if I do something and then I see that my health is getting better, that is the best motivator to continue doing that thing versus I think it's working. I feel good. I'm not so sure. There's a lot of things that people do. You'll hear people reel off the list of I'm doing all these things, and then when someone says, "Is it working?" they can't tell you definitively whether it is or it isn't, or they can't tell you it was because of this thing. They just say, "Well, I'm doing a bunch of things, and it seems to be working because I'm getting healthy, but I don't know what the cause is." And that's, I think, the thing that now with AI and synthetic data and so on, we can start to solve.
Absolutely. And I think you've also raised a few points, actually, in just what you've described. I mean, the whole focus on how we are all individually motivated is obviously a really important thing to get right. But I think what we're finding, and I think this is where the Human Exposome experiments that we need to basically embark on, is actually understanding to where the limits are, because we're very individual in terms of how we respond to these external stresses in our environment, whatever. But actually, we've reached a point where we have to take collective health responsibility for those impacts that we can't necessarily control on our own through our own agency, which is very much how a lot of people sort of see it at the moment. But I think the other thing that you mentioned, I mean, a lot of this is about positive environments. And of course, when you speak about loneliness, social isolation, if you look, for example, and we're in Miami, they have ambitions to be a longevity city. And of course, they've just are investing quite heavily in this new Blue Zone Center, Dan Buettner's work. Blue zones, the areas where people tend to live, very long lives, plus 100, et cetera, the centenarians. A lot of that is down to having an environment where the basic stuff, access to really great food, that you probably grow on your own land, you exercise built into your daily routines. You don't have to necessarily go to a gym to get your exercise. But a lot of it is down to having communities and people who look after each other and feeling very connected to your communities. So I think these are all the lessons. And I think with the data piece, and with obviously the technologies like Pete, you're a very good example of, we actually can reach a point where we can have what I call move towards the measurable blue zones to really understand how the environments are impacting individual, but also, population health, which is a really interesting area that I think will be opened up, with more research on the Human Exposome. So I'm going to, now I just had a message from Paul. He has had a fire alarm, so hopefully he will be rejoining us in his building. So that's the reason why we weren't able to access him a few minutes ago, but hopefully he'll pop up later on. But I'm going to move to Rachel, because how do you see, because I mean, in the end, I mean, you're a very, very good example of the work that you're doing around the world, where you are basically trying to create healthy environments, healthy places, clean air. What are some of the, I guess, and you're working around the world, and of course, some parts of the world have much more serious problems with air quality than others. Like I was in Delhi recently, and my goodness, they have an issue with air quality there, which is unlike, many places. But can you just speak to sort of where around the world, with some of the examples and some of the case studies that you have that kind of show really how dramatic it is by addressing that one single cause of air quality, and perhaps making reference to the microplastic situation as well, where possible? That would be fantastic.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Thank you. We have some very, very, very exciting things happening, and I'm also really excited about the role of technology, AI, and data points, because so much data has already been collected. The one project in particular that I think is so exciting is we've been looking at military housing within the DoD. Military housing has been a big public crisis. There were 2 public accountability reports written. All of our Congress in the U.S. is very, very aware of what's happening. There have been some very, very massive lawsuits happening when you have, government and or public supported housing for our military and or affordable housing supported by governments like the UK, where we're not providing a clean enough living environment. So 2 big issues. One, mold is a huge issue, which I already mentioned before, but also just to the microplastics, these forever chemicals. Anything near a military base, the plastics used to wrap some of the actual storage of ammunition was actually full of microplastics and harmful forever chemicals. So they're in the soil of every single local areas. So not only on base where there's certainly a big problem, but also around those bases, which are in the heart and fabric of our communities, right? There's also work being done in the UK currently on, radon in certain areas where things were disposed of improperly that now have other elements of control on the water in that environment. So, really interesting to see. What we find is we do have the technology to remove forever chemicals and microplastics. We do have the technology to also clean the air, and it's done through a myriad of ways that take a lot of education. So it's very exciting to see. We know about the built environment. We have the results. And now I think we're in this really interesting place of the intersection between education and also public policy. And then there are a lot of fun points we can talk about, air quality in particular as it relates around the globe. There are kind of two ways you can clean the air, just to keep it simple. You can do it through an HVAC if you have a central system. A lot of places do. A lot of places don't have a central system. So if you don't live in a hot, sweaty climate like the Mideast or the Southeast of the U.S., you don't necessarily even have a full HVAC system in your home. So in that case, you might have a split system, a window system, or you might need to actually open and get some outside air, but purify the air as you sleep with a standalone, just a very simple standalone unit. And then for example, in standalone units do a great job removing the contaminants right around the airway you breathe. But you do have to use the right type. Because, for example, if you don't get a filter that would kill the mold on that filter, it'll propagate the mold and make it worse. So the thing that is your tool could literally be your contaminant at the same time. So this takes a lot of public education and a lot of awareness. Thank God this thing called COVID made us very aware of air and the airborne environment. Sadly, we've had a lot of hyper nature incidents like fire and floods and things that have really brought to our attention the environmental factors. But we do have, the good news is we do have a path. We do have the tools. It's a matter of distribution and awareness to really get to them.
So that's so interesting. And I think you've raised a few points which I might ask Ben about, actually, because it's a whole, like, how can we actually, really hit the public health agenda with all of this? I mean, there's one thing, we need public education. Of course, that's one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing now with Ocean Burn, that people become more aware of the threats, obviously, of microplastics as a result of, plastics accumulating in our oceans, etc., and in other places. But also, I mean, so you can take examples, I guess, some previous examples, like lead, for example, lead contamination. And now, of course, lead poisoning and lead is now becoming much more factored in terms of the awareness around it, but also in terms of the action around that. Certainly in the UK, there's a massive focus on that at the moment. But also like pesticides, DDT. So it's almost like microplastics. The evidence is emerging. Of course, we're seeing it in all bodily fluids now. We've seen the recent piece in Nature Medicine, I think, on, I think it's 7 grams in the brain, equivalent to a spoon. These are all, the data is just starting to emerge, and how do we get it to the point where it can really start to drive, public health? Because, I mean, the one thing that Rachel has described, and we're already seeing it being factored into building regulations, all the work the International Well Building Institute are doing. So it's actually, really starting to drive policy, etc. What's your assessment of what more evidence that we need, and where the evidence gaps are to really start to drive more, I guess, government and public attention as a public health issue on this?
Yeah, so there really are evidence gaps with microplastics. And for context, we published a paper in Nature Medicine showing microplastics in the brain. That was published, within the last 12 months. And the other key paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, a very well-established medical journal, showed microplastics in blood vessels. So it was in the carotid plaques, which are kind of fatty deposits in the blood vessel that supplies the brain with blood. That was, again, within the last 12 months. So those are probably the kind of pivotal studies that have really made people raise awareness, but both within the last 12 months. And there's a real issue which kind of Pete touched upon around cause and effect. So, you know, with smoking, this very famous study from the 1950s, they looked at doctors, those who smoked, those who didn't smoke, followed them. The time is a really important variable here. Followed them for a number of years. Those who smoked were much more likely to get lung cancer. Now, where is your control group for plastics, right? Where do you find the population that's matched, that is not exposed to plastics? That's obviously a huge challenge. And so the approach being taken, at least in the study in the New England Journal of Medicine, this was looking at people with heart disease. What they did there, which is quite a neat approach, because ideally you want a sample of a human while they're still alive, right, to see if the plastic is there or not, and then you follow them over time to see what diseases they might develop. And that's what they did. They found plastics in about half of these carotid plaques, and then they followed people for a few years. They showed those who had higher levels of plastics had higher levels of stroke, heart attack, and death. So that's a very important study, and it's very suggestive. But there's a number of challenges here. They're looking mostly by eye. So they're looking, they're looking down a microscope. They're looking, you see these little shards of plastics. There are chemical analyses that can be done, but again, they require, they're not perfect. They're only measuring some types of plastics, not others. They are reliant on these biopsies, which are very invasive. So you're kind of reliant on when a surgeon is already operating on somebody. And then you're asking the surgeon, can I have some of this sample so I can test it for plastics? So we need more research. By comparison, the Nature Medicine study looked in the brain. This was cadavers. This is people who are already dead. So there's no time variable there. So there's no real cause and effect. The authors have to say, we can't demonstrate cause and effect. They showed that there was higher levels of microplastics, or more likely to be microplastics, in the brains of people who had dementia at the point of death. But because you're just looking at a snapshot, that's actually quite a weak evidence base, even though we chose to publish it because there's so little data out there. So we really need funders. We need funders to be funding more research into microplastics, because I would say, unlike some of the other exposures we've talked about where the evidence is clear, the evidence is growing, but we're really not there yet. And then we need more data on the evidence. There is clear in the human body, right? Done, tick. The evidence, the impact on human health, I'd say we need more evidence. And then what's the mechanism? How is that happening? Which is, if there is an effect on health, it's probably some immunological process. We need much more data on that as well, because I think without that data, you're going to struggle to persuade this enormous number of industries that are using plastics.
So really,
already too late, because it's already in water supply, it's already in the air. Are we kind of like just measuring something that we've already done based on the environmental? How do we reverse? What's the technology to take that out of the food and the water?
That's a good. That's it. Just to follow on that, that is an area of growth. I wrote a piece for Nature Biotechnology on plastic eating bacteria. So they do occur naturally. Bacteria will find a way. If you go to bottle plastic recycling plant and you see there's a bit of kind of slime on a bottle, if you isolate that, there's probably bacteria eating that plastic, and that it looks a bit like kind of the leaf wall. so they've either evolved to do that, or you can engineer them to do that. And actually, there's a in France there is a biorecycling plant being built for plastic bottles and plastic clothing, which the bacteria will turn those into the constituent parts and then turn those into new bottles and clothes. But the real challenge is, how do you do that in something where the plastics are really dispersed, like in the water? It's a challenge, but there are experimental approaches which are it's called bioremediation. It's using natural plants, fungi, bacteria to remove these, similar to what you would do if something, I mean, you mentioned military sites with a site contaminated with other toxins, forever chemicals, PFAS, uranium. A lot of these approaches would use bioremediation. So I think, again, that's an area which governments are funding. Actually, the US military is a funder of some of this research, as are governments. The government of South Korea is funding some. So this is a good growth area and you know, can be commercialized, which is often the key to widespread adoption.
Yeah.
So actually you made a really good point, and I'm going to turn to Pete and Rachel to comment on this, and hopefully Paul will join us back before we close in about 12 minutes. So the commercial drivers in this, I mean, are also they are the contributors, but actually what we're really interested in, like what commercial drivers will actually be part of the solution. And actually that was very much at the heart of something that I was involved in a few months back, where we pitched as a future moonshot for X Prize, which is a big prize in the States. They're doing a big health span X Prize at the moment, so very sort of, you know, sponsor back, commercially driven, the tech of the future that will deal with some of the big, you know, big sort of societal world problems of the day. And so we pitched the Human Exposome project as a future moonshot. And of course, what we were looking at there was what is the tech that we need that will actually be able to measure at an individual level how we are responding to all these external threats and contaminants, etc., stresses in our environment. So that was the gap that we were really looking at, the personal tech, our personal exposome. How do we measure that to get that data to actually really to understand, you know, the drivers at an n=1 level, and then of course aggregated up, you can understand, you know, things at a more sort of macro aggregated level, and so which is really interesting because again, you know, if you can get, you know, the commercial sector being part of the solution to actually clean up the oceans, and of course that's a huge rationale for obviously what Ocean Burn are trying to do, and indeed was one of the X Prize moonshots in terms of climate, you know, looking at, you know, the plastic islands, you know, how do we actually get rid of them? So I think that commercial piece is really, really interesting. And of course, one of the things I wanted to mention, I think a couple of people on the call now have been invited as well, is the launch of the Exposome Moonshot that is going to be launched officially in May in Washington, D.C., which is backed by Bloomberg, has a huge array of international institutions involved. But effectively what they're trying to do is to develop the roadmap for the Human Exposome Project as a follow-on to the Human Genome Project. So the time has come, and I think the world is starting to realize the time has come to do this. But of course, a big part of it is how do we get the commercial driver in all of this and actually look at, you know, the tech for good, the business for good aspect of this to actually be part of the solution. So if I could turn to Pete first and maybe Rachel to speak to that, like what are the sort of the new commercial models and new investment models, the new way that we can really incentivize this, because if money's to be made, that is a massive driver for change. You know, obviously public policy is key, governments and obviously the general public. But could you perhaps share a few perspectives on that, just from your perspective, Pete, if I turn to you first?
Yeah, no, and I think, look, my job as a founder is always to find a scalable revenue growth opportunity to some impact that I want to have, otherwise I won't be successful. Right? So whilst our mission is to give 1 billion years of health back to the world by the end of this decade, I won't get there if I'm just going to convince people to give me money to try and have impact. There needs to be an ROI. And so we took our go-to-market approach for this, and I'm sharing it more as a perhaps insight transferable learning approach to how we can do this to the exosome as a whole, is that like with any good business that scales, you have to impact upon value drivers that are meaningful to organizations or individuals such that they pay for it. And in our case, we realized that a key value driver for the health diagnostic industry, for example, the companies that sell you a blood test or genetic test, is to sell more tests. And there's only two ways they can do that. They can either do that by getting more customers or getting the same customers to get tests more often. And so what we found in building the consumer app was that when people got their biological age, it catalyzed them into becoming more actively monitoring their biological age. And that's something that we can deliver via a blood test. And then moreover, it doesn't require a separate blood test. It can be piggybacked onto an existing test. So the key is to remove friction from the process. So in our case, we did that by piggybacking off of existing tests. And second of all, by making it work with nearly every test, i.e. only 4 markers. So that means pretty much every panel that a lab group can sell, and we extend it to include every genetic test. And so that means that in all of their SKUs, they can add this Humanity Age report on top, and they can just either sell that for more money, or they can say if you spend a certain amount of money, you get access to this thing as well, or you give it away for free, which is our preferred approach, which means everyone gets it without them even realizing they need it. And then that catalyzes them to go, you know what, I need to get this again in 6 months' time. And so that creates more revenue for the lab groups, and then indirectly the customers become more engaged and they become healthier. So it's how do we come up with equivalent sort of go-to-market strategies where if you can show an employer, a lab group, a health system that cares about population health, that if they invest in this solution, it's going to bring an ROI. Like we've seen in preventative health, generally for every dollar you spend on prevention, it's like $5 to $10, not more ROI in terms of, you know, healthy years of productive, you know, economic development, which Andrew J. Scott and David Sinclair Martin proved in their sort of like paper. So I think that it's how do we bring that more tangibly into the realms of today? Because the problem is politicians think in terms of terms. And they're not going to invest in something that's going to benefit society in 20 years' time, most likely. They need to know that it's going to impact the current mandate. And so that's why you need ways to measure improvement now. And that's why if you can impact, for example, you know, waiting lists now, that hospitals will get less, you know, they'll get shorter because less people get sick now. That will be a good big driver for the government to go, let's throw, you know, X hundred million towards that now. And that's, I think, what we need. We need early lead measures to the lag measures of this is showing an effect so that we can invest more money into this, and then so the cascade of the solution to the problem happens.
So it's super fascinating. Just before I turn to Rachel, and this is a segue, I guess, to some of the conversation I've been having with Rachel, is what's really interesting in the UK context, for example, because our poor health has literally reached a point, you know, workforce and activity rates, et cetera, that the economy has started to be dragged down as a result. There's been increasing focus, you know, how is health linked to economic growth? So we've been working with the Office for National Statistics to work that out and actually help to incentivize investment in health as an asset, because, you know, we've reached this level. We reached the burning platform. And this is a context for a lot of discussions that I've been having with Rachel, you know, where there is a lot of, you know, there's a lot of evidence now that really is clearly showing the impact between health and, you know, and prosperity. So over to you, Rachel, because and of course other countries are recognizing that whole equation, you know, prevention pays, you know, don't leave it till we're sick. You've got to prevent ill health, and that has big bangs and big returns for the economy. Over to you, Rachel.
Well, I really, really like this notion of measuring the now and just a nod out to like all of the increase in technology and things like sensors that have just exponentially gotten cheaper. And we've seen in the last 10 years especially, and getting more affordable by the minute, so that, you know, I've got 3 air sensors right now in my own home that measure particles. So if the particle count goes up, I can get an alert on my app to let me know, oh, something's not going right with the situation, you know? So I think, number one, active real-time measurement is so important.
Yeah.
And that really can be possible now with every single investment that we're making. And that's really, really great. And then areas like the project we're working on with ONS as well as NHS in the UK, it's very, very exciting, because when we look at the built environment and the things that can be controlled completely without any behavior change, okay? So behavior change and non-behavior change. This is really, really interesting point of where we are in society. If we can do things first, 0 behavior change, and just look at the built environment, it gives this baseline of the built environment and that person's health.
Yes.
If we get enough sample size of just that improvement of air quality in those 800,000 homes, we get a sample size. And now we can look across those myriad of health concerns myriad of the individual is so unique. We can literally be all measured by a thumbprint, not to mention our health concerns, right?
Yeah.
But we can start to see that. Yeah, Pete, I know. It's so exciting.
I build on what you're saying, because I was reading in a book recently, The Revenge of the Tipping Point. I don't know if you read it from Malcolm Gladwell. And he was talking about the pollutant particles from in the outside of the home environment. But it's known in society that, for example, the top 5% of the most polluting vehicles cause 50% of the particles that we breathe in the air that are toxic. And yet we get everybody to measure the level of the toxins in our car. Everyone pays for that test, and we do very little to get those 5% of the worst offenders off the road. And it's a systemic societal issue as to, do we isolate and target the worst perpetrators of this?
Polluter pays.
Versus we do it, information asymmetry, it's a shared problem.
Well, recently in East Texas, there was an additive that was added to the fuel, the diesel and all the biofuels. This additive reduced the asthma rates in those areas of just where the fuel terminals are located.
Yeah.
Very, very interestingly, when I ran across this company, I said, oh my gosh, you mean, where else are you using? Well, just Texas and Louisiana. Those are just some places we knew the people. Like, what? You mean you already reduced asthma rates just by adding something to the fuel? I said, how much does this stuff cost? They said, oh, it's just a penny. I said, what?
Yeah.
It's a penny. Yeah. And we share the part of the penny with everybody in the byline. I was like, brilliant.
Yeah.
This is exactly the way we incentivize. Hey, nobody will ever notice a penny, number one. And then when we all, as all parts of the downline distribution, share a part of that penny, it really goes fast with high volume cases. So I think what's exciting about AI, and what I'm working with one group now in the UK about running some analysis on impact for things we know we can go ahead and roll out now in order to prioritize government funds. And I think that is kind of the most urgent revolution. And then for sure, being very, very, very clever around coalition building.
Yeah.
Just a nod to IWBI. They are absolutely the best conveners I've ever seen. A public consensus between art and science. They really bring everyone together in such a beautiful way. So we're excited to see a global air quality task force and education force that'll be regionally oriented launch out this year. And this group, they're so efficient. They literally pull together the greatest minds in less than a month. You know, so these are things happening literally this year
now.
in 2025.
So you know what? So Rachel, Rachel, we've got a lot to learn from the successes that you've had with the coalition building, and as you've just described. So you've made a fantastic kind of closing statement, you know, on how we can actually build this global movement, which is my final question, really. So I'm just, and unfortunately, we're going to have to pull in Paul maybe a bit later because he hasn't been able to get free yet, because he was going to talk about the foodome and food and what have you. But perhaps he can join later. But can I just have one closing, I guess, comment from Pete first, and then Ben about this coalition building? What do you think is the single most important thing that we need to do to really get this high enough on the agenda to really, really start to address the whole link between human and planetary health, the Human Exposome, basically? Pete first, and then closing statement.
To Rachel, I want to collaborate with her just because she's super positive and good energy about what she believes in, and I think we all need to be a lot more of that in general. I mean, one of our values as an organisation is open collaboration, and you know, I don't believe in a world of scarcity ever, but we live in a world of abundance, and I think that, you know, by bringing, you know, people that think about how we can have population health impact together, like what you're doing so well, Tina, and what you do, and you know, every person here, Ben, like in what you're doing with nature and health, I think this is part of the manifestation of what will drive to that tipping point of change. I think we just need to bring more like-minded, impact-oriented people together who recognise this opportunity, and I think it will happen faster than we think, because it happens really slowly until it happens really quickly, like in many areas in life. So I just think that, you know, if we keep nudging it forwards, and leveraging the best of technology out there. We are really at a point where things shift in weeks, where they shift in decades. Every day there's a new announcement of something that we couldn't do, literally, that changes society, because we can suddenly do this new thing. And so we're only just trying to work out how to leverage these new technologies. So I think it's really about how we can come together and be ready for when we can take it to the next level.
Thanks so much, Pete. Brilliantly said. And Ben, final closing statement, and then we'll close, and we're going to bring on Charles to talk about his personal story with being tested for microplastics. So Ben, over to you, and then we'll close.
Yeah, I really agree with what Pete said. We need more interdisciplinary collaborations, including between researchers, but we also need to rethink how evidence and research influences policy as a whole, and really establish better connections between the research community and policymakers, because there is a growing disconnect, I think, between those groups, and we need more interactions, relationships, understanding of those groups meeting together, and not just kind of once a year or as a one-off once you've got your research, but more long-standing partnerships between those who are making policy, including in politics, and the research community.
And the fact that we're all here today is a testament to that. We need to reach out of our boxes and silos and collaborate. So I think that's a really, really strong message to end on. So I'm going to close the session. Hopefully we'll bring in Paul later. Close the session. I just want to say thank you so much, Pete, Rachel, Ben, of course, Paul, for joining. And it's been a super interesting conversation. And I hope there'll be many more conversations like that will really spur action. We've mentioned a few things that are ongoing, obviously the stuff that Rachel's doing, obviously Pete, and of course the new global, the nature health title. These are all steps in the right direction for us to become a growing force to actually change, how we think about health and its link to climate and planetary health. So thank you all. We'll close there. I'm going to bring in Charles next to talk about his personal story about his quest to be tested for microplastics. So, but thank you all.
Before we go, thank you, Tina, for bringing us all together. Such a beautiful job getting everyone organized. So amazing work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
you.
you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Wonderful. That was a beautiful conversation.
Great.
I heard that it's time for my personal story. Or
yes. Well, it's time to bring you on if we want to keep to time. So it's up to you. And hopefully now Paul unfortunately has been called out for a fire alarm drill.
Oh, no.
So he might have reemerged. So I don't know, and I know he's got a couple of hours. So it depends on how long. But I can message him, and if we can bring him on a bit later, let's do that. But I think the floor is yours now to talk about your story, because of course we know other people who have been coming out with kits to test microplastics. Brian Johnson, as we know, who most people will probably have heard of, he's got his testing kit out. So there is starting to, these are starting to become much more accessible to the consumer. But over to you, because I know you've got a story to tell.
Yeah. So my story was really quite simple, but apparently not suitable for the medical establishment. I mean, as I started working on Ocean Burn, and we had the idea, and the core team came together, and we started putting together kind of the content map, so to speak. The evidence was just absurd and shocking that 100% of human 100% of human testicles 100% of human semen that they had tested as part of this study contained a significant amount of microplastics, and that then I started looking at the research into the other organs, and it just became very apparent. I was like, oh my goodness, I am curious. I'm simply curious. Like, how much microplastic do I have in my semen? And I went to the my primary care physician, and I told him that I wanted to get my normal blood work stuff, all the different tests, do like an STD panel, do my like whatever numbers, right? And then I also wanted to do a testicular exam. And he's like, "What? You're too young for that. You're too young for."
Was he surprised that you asked him?
Yeah, he was surprised. He's like, "Are you in pain?"
Yeah.
I was like, "No, no pain." And he's like, "Well, what?" did your dad die of testicular cancer? And I was like, no, nothing like that. And it was simply, I read all this research about microplastics in the semen and the reproductive organs, and I want to figure out how much I have. And he said, how much what? It was just such a foreign question. Like it was like there was no kind of preset answer book for it, because I was just asking for something that was to ask. And so he sent me to the Quest Diagnostics, and I got the test, and I was looking over the shoulder as she was putting the numbers in the, like the codes for which test to get in the machine, and I saw, this kind of like sperm count and like quality and motility and like all these things about my sperm. But and I said to her, I was like, oh no, my doctor, I'm specifically doing this to test for microplastics. So I do all that, but then add the number for the microplastics. And she said, oh, I'm not allowed to do anything that the doctor doesn't order. And I was like, oh, okay, well, but you do have a test for microplastics, right? They told me that I had to come to this facility because it was the only facility that could do this test. And she said, no, I've never heard of anyone getting, collecting a sample for microplastics. And I was like, what? How long have you been doing this work? And she's like, I've been doing this for 10 years. And I see, thousands of patients, a month, and da-da-da-da-da.
And do you think it's because, do you think it's because she's normally seeing patients or people who have come with a particular illness or something that needs to be diagnosed rather than just out of concern, if you see what I mean? Because that's part of the problem with our sick care approach to health. You kind of wait till you're really broken and need to be fixed.
For sure, I mean, that was evident in my doctor's line of questioning when I asked him to do the order. Right? He asked me, like, do you have pain? Is there a family history of this? Did anything happen? Did you have some physical trauma? Right? So he was going through this list of reasons why there might be something wrong with me. And that I might, or rather, not even that something was wrong with me. He was looking for symptomology.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. He was looking to diagnose me on symptomology and sort me into these various triages and buckets that the American Medical Association has established. And I just, it got to the point where there wasn't even a record in the computer. And when I was speaking to this phlebotomist is what they're called, who take the blood, phlebotomist. I asked her if she was aware, that this was a thing. And she said, no, I've never heard of microplastics in the reproductive organs. And I said, well, I hate to say it, but I got microplastics in me, and you got microplastics in your uterus. And we both got.
Because that's the scary thing. I mean, microplastics, they've literally been found in most tissue in the human body. Scarily, and in obviously very large quantities, as we've just heard in the brain, for example, which has now been linked, with dementia and Alzheimer's, etc. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. The number that I read was like in most of the major organs, it's 500 micrograms per gram of tissue, but in the brain, it's about 10 times that. So we're looking at 5 to 10 grams of nanoplastic. Everybody's got a plastic spoon in their brain.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly.
I was so.
And that was reported quite heavily in the UK press, by the way. So it's, these are the sorts of things. So this is your point about media. We have to inform the media properly so that they can communicate, in the appropriate way to the consumer, and the mass public. Yeah.
Indeed. And there's a whole. There's a wonderful book that was written called Bad Science by, I believe, Ben Goldberg.
Yes, Ben Goldberg, yes. Oh, Goldacre, sorry. Goldacre.
Yeah. Yes. So, if I remember correctly, he was a physician that decided to write this book about about the interplay between scientists and, I guess, their own reputations. Reputation is a nice word for ego or narcissism. And then the interplay between that sort of internal political landscape of publications and publish or perish, and how that internal competition is perceived by the media, and how, because there's this internal competition of ideas where the scientists know what's in it and what's the kind of like slight subtle differences between them, but when the media is reading these publicly available published journal articles and some of them I guess not so public, right? You have to pay for them, but eventually it gets out, and someone writes an article about how red wine cures cancer, right? And that article about how red wine cures cancer, it quotes the co-founder of the company, who is a professor from Harvard. And they started this company, and they raised tens of millions of dollars, and that company was purchased by GlaxoSmithKline.
Yes, we know the person, yes.
Failed in clinical trials. So, this whole thing about the way that, like the stories within science that the media chooses to tell, and chooses to tell with a particular agenda, right? That's the thing too, right? Is that all of these media companies are privately held.
Well, I mean, I think the point that you raise very importantly, and this is one of the main barriers to really changing our system of sick care, is how I call it, to one more based on prevention, is all the vested interests that are caught up in keeping the status quo. Food companies, pharma companies, interestingly, obviously, no matter, these are all big industries that are making a lot of money through us being unhealthy, and that's part of the problem. And so the vested interest piece is really, really important to address. So somehow we need to come up with the right, incentives, to be able to incentivize companies in the commercial sector to do stuff that's actually going to be enhancing health rather than harming it. So that's a big area, and of course feeds into a lot of the stuff that I know I do in the UK context and so forth. But you're absolutely right. This is one of the biggest challenges. And of course the media industry is again very, very influenced by the lobbyists and the people who want to get their message out for their products. And we know how it all works. So this is the challenge.
We know it all works. And we could talk about the system all we want, right? We could talk about the companies and the companies funding the sponsored research agreements to the universities so they can get the patents. We could talk about the private foundations, grant makers, and the RFPs, right? Like especially the any sort of government or DoD, Department of Defense, NASA, right? Put out these requests for grant proposals, right? This is the science that's actually being done. Right? The science that's being done is the science that's being funded by these different groups.
Yeah.
Right? And people generally reading newspaper articles about science, they don't realize the internal mechanisms of the thing make it such that 55% of all published journal articles are not reproducible.
Yeah.
In our modern era, in the cultural zeitgeist, most people claim proudly atheism and science.
So, and of course, this again goes back to the problem that we have in terms of incentives, because of course, academics, they're incentivized to publish. They need to publish papers. That's the key metric on which they are judged, how many papers they've published. So it's not the quality necessarily, and it's not the ability to solve a really important societal question. So again, it comes down to what is the incentives that are driving all of our behavior? So that is a massive and fundamental piece to all of this.
Imagine if for someone that's using science in the place of religion, right? Can you imagine if someone told you that 55% of the Bible was absolutely wrong? We just don't know which half.
Yeah.
Is the first half? Is the second half? Is just a few lines, right? Right.
Yeah.
When you believe the word of God, you believe the word of God, right? And what the current modern era, I believe, is suffering from to some degree as a spiritual suffering, as a psychic suffering, is that most of the previous generations of humans had this unwavering belief in whatever God that they were raised in. This there was certainty to it. And if you weren't certain about it, then people would question you. People would stone you even. They would exile you, right? And so this, but what this certainty gives you in the sort of PTSD psychological sense is psychological safety. Right? The safety that no matter how bad it gets, my God has got me. Right? And even though that's not true, right? There's tons of disease or tons of whatever, but religious people would say oh, it was his time. Right? It was their time, right? God chose them. God brings them to heaven, right? In every religion, monotheism that has a concept of heaven, they have some story along those lines, right? But now those people, the humans haven't changed.
Yes.
Just the information in the zeitgeist has changed, right?
Yeah.
So the things that emotionally satisfy us on a physiological level are the same. So when people choose not to believe in God because they have whatever intellectual reason to not do it, and they choose to believe in science, they don't know that half of the thing that they're choosing to believe is completely not certain.
Yeah.
And yet they're holding it in this place of psychological safety that no matter what happens to me, no matter how many potato chips I eat, no matter how much I microplastic no matter how much I microwave my saran wrap, right? My doctor's going to save my life. Science, my doctor has got me.
Yes.
My God has me, right? And this is the greatest. I had a beautiful conversation with my professor of economics from MIT, Abhijit Banerjee. He won the Nobel Prize. He wrote this amazing book. It's called Core Economics, right? And I asked him once, Professor, I asked it in a very dignified way. I said, so Professor, to what degree do you believe that a region's religious, dominant religion influences its economy? And he said, "Wow, Charles, what a profound question." but no. What he actually said was that it was fundamental.
Yeah.
Was that the dominant religion was the dominant zeitgeist of value. For all of the economic activity that happens in the community is in some way a first, second, or third derivative of these core religious values. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And this, I think that is really what's driving, if we're talking about the core incentives of the scientific industry, is they are trying to replace God in that way of deciding when someone can die. Right? I actually was invited last minute to the after party of Brian Johnson's Don't Die conference. Yeah. Okay. And I chatted with a few of these community members about their philosophy and their ideology, and it's just it's a different way. It's a different take. Sure. Right. Absolutely. This desire, and in the Buddhist sense, right? Me, I'm a Buddhist. Right? So we talk about this. This desire for man to have choice of when to die. This thing that was previously and for all of history subscribed to the power of the gods. Right? The first power of the gods was the creation of humanity. Right? Humans can do that. We can create babies. So we get that satisfaction. But then the other power of gods is to decide when someone dies. Yeah. Yeah. And this is what is the obsession. Absolutely. People they don't use this word language. I think I'm a quite strange person for using this vocabulary, but it is only because I have I took the Buddhist oath when I was 4 years old. Right? My mom didn't raise me in a temple, but we went to it all the time. She herself practiced acupuncture, Chinese medicine, herbs and everything, and also qigong. Yeah. Right? And so she taught some of these very basic qigong breathing exercises and how to move the energy through my body whenever I felt uncomfortable. And it was wildly effective at helping me with my ADHD, neurodivergence thing when I was a kid. Yeah. But then, she pushed me, despite all of this spiritual and I guess Eastern knowledge, she pushed me very, very hard so that I could get into MIT. Yeah. Into the Tiger Mom. Into the center of the Western matrix, right? In fact, anyways, the creators, right? Like MIT invented the internet. But it was a big component of inventing the internet. But interesting. This unique, and then I got super into the yoga and the pranayama, and I had those extremely inexplainable physiological experiences that I could only think is what other people have referred to as a religious connection. This connection with God, this connection with the Atman, this connection with whatever. Sure. And so in order to figure out what happened to me, exactly, I started studying all these neuroscience. I started getting involved with all these all neuroscientists that were doing this work. I started bringing bringing myself to them to show them this practice, to this stuff, and that's how I ended up writing the book, Don't Bunk Out, about the neuroscience stuff. But ultimately, bringing all the way back to the loop about, I wrote this book about how to retrain the neural connectivity between damaged regions of the brain. Right? So it was research that just happened to coincide with all the things that I was doing, that I was became a very serious practitioner of it. And then I got to the point in running this organization, teaching meditation, for a couple of years, and I realized, oh my goodness, there's no amount of neuroplasticity training that you can do to get rid of the microplastics in your brain.
Exactly. So, so Charles, just to interrupt you very quickly, because I know Nikhil, who's our next guest, he is in the, I can see him, he's here, but we need to promote him to the central circle, so to speak. Sure. But I think, so we should do that in a second, and there he is. But just to quickly close, so hi Nikhil, we're going to come to you in 1 second. I'm just going to finish so I think what Charles, so your whole journey, I mean, basically you have been on a journey, and I think what's really interesting about where you are on this journey is there's the stuff, that you've been trying to work out in terms of your own story, your own sort of, quest, as it were, for your own, a good, healthy, long life for yourself, and indeed its impact on others, etc., with all the work that you're doing. And I think this is a whole kind of new frontier of longevity that I'm super, super interested in. And I wanted to bring, so I think it's, so Nikhil, who's going to be joining us, he will speak for himself and he will take us through some of the work that he's doing, but he is very, very, very ensconced in that whole world of actually really understanding from a scientific standpoint what is actually going on in our bodies and being impacted by all the things that we've just been talking about, because this is a new frontier and he's got some tech that's actually really, really exciting that he's going to show us. So Charles, I don't know if you got all the answers that you wanted from the microplastic testing that you did. There's clearly... Oh,
actually, I'm realizing we didn't even finish the main punchline. Okay, the main punchline. Let's come back to it. I'm sorry, just a moment.
Yeah, sure.
Apologize. So after these, getting the semen tested, and of course, there was no information on the readout about microplastics. So then I scheduled an appointment with a urologist through my primary care. I went to the urologist. He asked me the same line of questions, like, are you experiencing pain? Did anyone die from this? Like, you're way too young to be here.
Yes.
Why are you here? This doesn't even matter, right? And so then, they do the inspection, they do the ultrasound.
Yes.
And, basically, I ended up chatting with the doctor that was seeing me, and he was, very interested in what I had to say. So he invited his partner in there, so these two doctors, and they both said that I was the first person that had ever come to them asking for this thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
That in fact, in the city of Las Vegas, there was no place that you could order this test.
Yeah.
And you would have to go to a hyper specialized facility.
Yeah.
And I was like, what do you mean hyper specialized? Can't a high school student look through a microscope?
Yeah. No, exactly.
Plastic in a sample?
Yeah.
Isn't that, can you just let me use your microscope right now?
So what you're speaking to, so you obviously are super motivated, super interested in getting, the answers to the questions that you had. So this is where, so what Nikhil is doing is super interesting, because he again is tapping into a group who are super motivated to understand what is driving their health. And so he's going to share with us some interesting stuff that he's doing. So Charles, should we bring Nikhil on? He's there at the bottom. Let's promote him.
All he's got to do is Nikhil, if you can just click one of the circles in the middle of the screen, then you'll automatically go. There you go.
Excellent, wonderful.
Right. Do you want me to be part of this conversation in three-way, or did you want to do one-on-one?
So basically, Nikhil is here for a show and tell. He's going to show us some stuff that he's doing, which will give us a real inside look into the world of biomarkers. And so obviously, so I think let's hand over to Nikhil. And then we can comment and ask questions as we go. But Nikhil, the floor is yours. And I know you can share your screen to show us some stuff if you'd like. But so just I've obviously known you for a while. We've been on this journey together to kind of get the world to understand this world of biomarkers and how to measure them, how to track them, how to connect it up to our health outcomes, how it's connected to the exposome, and the whole world of decentralized trials, of which we need more to actually really understand what is happening at an n=1 level, is all the stuff that we've been talking about and planning for. So over to you, Nikhil. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're trying to do, and how this really shapes the whole discussion around understanding the human exposome and its links to longevity. Over to you, Nikhil.
Awesome. Thank you, Tina, for having me here. And also thank you, Charles, for explaining over all the stuff that you had been dealing with. I have had very similar experiences, and I would like to share some of them over here right now. So, by introduction, I am Nikhil. I'm co-founder and CEO of this company called Helome. We work at the intersection of AI and human-computer interaction to understand how to measure your aging and figure out what's accelerating it and help you slow it down. But even before we go into all of these aspects of measuring aging and slowing it down, I want to share some really important things about this whole field and biomarkers and the exposome. So I would like to share my screen.
Great.
Just a minute.
And I should mention you're one of the co-authors of the Nature Medicine paper that we referred to earlier in the session, which is great. So thank you, Nikhil.
Thank you. Thank you. So is everyone able to see my screen? I guess it appears at the top.
It's at the top, and I'm now expanding it. Yeah, I'm going to expand it now.
Okay. Okay, sweet. So basically, we all have two options, right? The option one is we wait for our brains and body to decay, and we spend last 30 to 40 years of our life with frequent visits to emergency room and spending 50% of our life savings on diseases that we cannot solve and live a miserable life. Or we could just use all the tools, everything, and all the resources that we have available today, including AI, to radically accelerate the clinical research, both at a scale as well as at personal level. Now, you might have a question, because we have OpenAI building ChatGPT, Anthropic building Claude and DeepSeek and many other frontier AI models that are constantly coming up and improving themselves day by day. Wouldn't AI on its own solve all these problems that we have, with respect to microplastics and chronic illness and aging? I would claim no. Automatically, AI is not going to solve any of these problems, and I would take you through the reasoning. The issue is we have 2 billion people currently living on Earth who are suffering from specific chronic illnesses. So these are not acute diseases. These are diseases like depression or Crohn's disease or IBS or all sorts of autoimmune conditions. And there are over 7,000 of these diseases that we have no cures. And generally, when technology improves, for example, in the last 3 decades, the quality of life has been constantly increasing because of increased and democratic access to the technology, right? So whenever technology increases, things are supposed to become nice and beautiful. However, in the last 3 decades, all the incidents of chronic illness has been increasing. Alzheimer's, sleep disorders, autism, and your will to die, even if you don't need to die, and diabetes and IBS, everything has been constantly increasing. This is exact opposite of what we would call as a post-scarcity world. And to make things worse, we have lots of chemicals in our food, and in the air that we breathe around, including these microplastics now that we have been ingesting in. And we have no clue whatsoever about how any of them is affecting us. In fact, if this is the space of all the things that are currently affecting us, this green dot is how much we have some kind of a little bit of clarity about. And even the clarity is blurred out, like in a zoomed out average version. Like in general, you know what is good, what is bad, but we never know what's precisely good for you or for somebody else, right? And Charles was just saying about how 55% of these research papers are not reproducible, because if the research was done For example, in the east coast of US, it is no longer applicable already in the west coast of US, and forget about out of US, because the culture, the diet, the food that we eat, everything is so different, and everything has a huge interconnected, like a mess of causal links that give rise to diseases and all sorts of things, and none of that is studied today, and nobody collects that data. When you don't have any of this information, AI on its own cannot solve these conditions. And so another interesting aspect is, even if you put AI aside, we have a huge multi-trillion-dollar pharmaceutical industry, and every country has its own industry and its own version of FDA. But despite all of this, across all the molecules that could be studied, which may potentially have a positive impact on us, we have only studied around 21,000 of these chemicals. And a very tiny percent of these drugs are currently available for people to purchase. And just like how the incidence of chronic illness is constantly rising, the cost of making a drug is also constantly rising. It takes around a decade plus and 2.6 billion years to make a drug. This is also not a characteristic of a post-scarcity world. When you have better AI, we are supposed to be reaching closer to the singularity. And when we're closer to singularity, things are supposed to be, things that flourish humans are supposed to be cheaper and more accessible. But the exact opposite of that happens when it comes to clinical research. And why is all of this happening? So one of the biggest reasons is, we just discussed that 2 billion people have chronic illness, right? None of these people, in most cases, are eligible for 80% of the clinical trials at all. For example, if a vaccine is studied in a clinical trial, essentially all the researchers in the trial are very keen on establishing the efficacy of the vaccine. So they don't want to get into the burden of proving the efficacy with so many confounding variables. But in reality, people have so many chronic illness, and there is a question of whether this person with a specific chronic illness can take vaccine A or vaccine B, and nobody has studied it. And because of this issue, first of all, the clinical trials fail, and second of all, of the little drugs that we have, we don't know what kind of side effects would these drugs give us, even if you take the drug. And we are on our own to figure out, how to deal with this. Even if you have a very good AI, the AI cannot do a clinical trial because by law, all these people with chronic illness are not allowed to be recruited in the clinical trials. So we need to change a lot of things top down by convincing the governments to start looking at all sorts of interactions that a human has, which is the exposome, and consider it into how our biomarkers are changing. And as that happens, there is a good team of people that are doing that. Should we just wait or not? I would say we don't need to keep waiting until we see our death. We can today fix a lot of these issues with the power of AI that we already have. So the way this would happen is, the AI agents would automatically keep collecting data at a massive scale from hospitals and research institutes, and also your personal data, and it will be constantly trying to understand how various drugs or chemicals or food interact with various biomarkers, and it turns out experiments that could be validated. And essentially, if you do it at scale, because AI is getting cheaper and cheaper, we could reach a true post-scarcity world where things that can decrease the suffering for humans would be cheaper as we improve this technology. And this is what we are trying to build. So how do we do this? So everybody that is remotely interested in improving their health probably has wearables and do regular blood work. I have a Whoop and Aura. So you could connect any of these wearables, and all of that data constantly comes in. And all of your information could be collected passively through browser agents, and you could also talk to your phone number. This is where we have been trying to perfect how humans can interact with computers and specifically AI efficiently. It is so boring to just sit and keep writing every day about what you had done, but it is super easy to just call a number and talk to your friend about how your day has been. So we had innovated a lot in trying to understand what modes of interactions between human and computer would increase the amount of information that we could collect. And several such modes include talking to your phone number, which would be received by an AI, and you could tell AI anything, or you could text a number on WhatsApp or Telegram or iMessages, or you could take a picture and send an image of what you are eating or who you are talking to today. All of that information constantly gets converted into a structured data format, and then we try to understand how the data reveals various things about our health. For example, this is all the parameters that people have volunteered so far on this platform. For example, anything like sleep duration, resting heart rate, tiredness, alertness, anything that could be tracked can be tracked as passively as possible. And I will show you the crazy kind of insights that we get from this kind of data and AI. For example, this is a chart for sleep duration. This is a snapshot. These are all the things that improve or make the sleep duration time worse. For example, this is how carbs impact sleep, and this is how sodium impacts sleep, and this is how protein impacts sleep. So this is an aggregated snapshot of all the people. And you could very precisely understand how various drugs or supplements impact sleep. And if you would like to take certain decisions in your life, then you could measure the quantitative risk of those decisions and be well informed of what you are getting when you take a specific supplement. And you could study this kind of analysis for all sorts of chronic illnesses and biomarkers. For example, this is how various treatments have helped improve or make anxiety worse. This is how various habits like exercise, deep breathing help people improve anxiety. And these are all other habits that either cause anxiety or caused by anxiety. So, the amount of information we get here, no clinical trial gets this information, and it's not there on the internet. People like us have to necessarily collect this information and feed it to AI for AI to solve these chronic illness issues. And remember, this is all still an aggregate snapshot. For you at a personal level, D3 may increase it, even though at a broad level for everybody, D3 decreases the anxiety. So we never know. We will only know if we experiment on ourselves and figure it out. So every person has that personal snapshot that is unique to them, which is in their world. But what I'm showing right now is the aggregated snapshot. So this would give you like a lot of insights on how to improve. For example, this is for deep sleep duration. And this is too much data, right? Like, how do you make sense of all of this data? Like, we tracked everything that could be tracked, and everything has a correlation number with something else. Too many numbers. So we build these AI agents that try to understand which of these biomarkers are causal in nature, or which of the habits have a causal relation to the outcome. And once we hypothesize on any such thing, then we do repeated A/B experiments on people who volunteer. These are people who are already taking the supplements or drugs. We try to do experiments with various dosages or going on and off with regimens and so on. And then you try to link it to the existing research, again, just with AI. And you try to hypothesize a potential mechanism of action, and you consistently keep testing. And over a period of time, you have a very strong signal, both at a personal level as well as at scale, as to what is going to help you alleviate specific symptoms regarding specific diseases or aging. So this is this entire stack of trying to do personalized N=1 studies. And I would say the goal of this stack is to decrease suffering. And one of the core components of decreasing human suffering is to improve the number of years humans live a healthy life. And what it boils down to mathematically is slowing down your biological age. So at Hilom, rather than just figuring out how to track all these habits, we try to make it easy for you to interact with the AI with phone numbers or text messages, and try to see how each of these things is impacting your age at a personal level. So you could just upload the reports that you got from your primary care physician. You don't need to get an extra set of biomarkers, because every biomarker is interlinked with everything else. Within the existing set of data that you already have, there is a lot of insights that could be extracted. So you could just have them uploaded here, and you could measure what insights could AI come up with, given all the past data that we have. And you could talk to the AI coach to keep improving it, and eventually publish those results automatedly, so that the broader community could use all of this information. And all of your data is part of a vault. It's a crypto vault, and you could share your crypto vault to specific research institutes and be part of a decentralized clinical trial, and help radically accelerate the pace at which clinical research is done for all chronic illnesses, including biological aging. That's it. This is what we are all up to, and all of this is open source. I would love for all of you to take a look and help us make this project larger and solve human suffering at scale.
So Nikhil, as ever, your work is so incredible and mind blowing, and I've seen parts of this before, but you remind me that the extent that you are drilling down into the intricacies of what is going on in our bodies at an N=1 level is just so interesting. And I guess, and obviously, and I know you're so committed to, the whole spirit of open research, open collaboration, and all the rest of it, which is clearly where we need to go with all of this. So I guess, and I'll let Charles also ask a question as well if he'd like, but so one of the things, I guess, you need access to people sharing their information, their data. How could we support you in that? And obviously we've been talking about the Exposome Moonshot program, and obviously you were very well aware of the X Prize that we pitched. How can we make it easier for you to get or do you have are you getting enough data to be able to drill down into the causalities of things, and where you want to take this?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So we now have a mobile app, as well as browser and web apps, but the data still isn't enough. Of all the data that I had shown, around 70% of the insights that we had derived so far, we cannot test them because we need even more people to statistically significantly test them. So we definitely need more people using this. And we have made it super easy for other, even for-profit companies to use this software because it's free, so that all of the data could come together in one place and have more insights driven. So right now, the best ways we can get data is either people talk to the AI on a phone number or message, because we found that it's the easiest way to help people interact with the system, because you could call it anytime, or you could request it to call you back, and you could just share anything that's going on in your life. And we have this system to continuously keep extracting the data of it. So the more people that talk to this AI or just passively allow it to extract your data, the better these insights are automatically going to become. So the numbers are all on the Hilom website. So it would be great if you all could share people to use this app, and it's not even going to disturb you unless you call it.
So I guess a specific question to ask you, and I know we've got our next guest about to come on, is so presumably, I mean, obviously we need more tech in terms of measuring microplastics and how it's hitting our system, our biology. And I know Brian Johnson's got this tech, and I know, and I know Charles just explained to us his experience in terms of getting tested. So presumably at the moment then, just being very specific on the microplastics question, presumably, are you getting any data at the moment, or is, because that's a whole area that obviously we'll be looking at.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, as of now, I have to check really whether people are submitting any data for it based on the tests. I'm just doing a check. So, microplastics. So.
And at the moment, a lot of your data is coming from around the world, isn't it? It is generally around the world. Yes. You're getting quite a lot from India, I understand, and also the US. Where else are you getting it?
India, US, UK, and also several countries from Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't really have any data for microplastics. I think it ties back to what Charles is saying. Nobody is able to measure it.
Exactly. So there's a huge gap there that we need to look at. Yeah.
Right. Essentially, for example, we are measuring these many markers, and it still doesn't have microplastics. And just the mere fact that there is some marker that is not even in the measurements, essentially we are missing out on a few insights that particular biomarker is contributing to it. So we have a huge gap in the amount of things that we could discover otherwise. And now if you consider how clinical research is done, they look at literally one or two markers and they exclude all the things that all other markers would interact with. They try to control it with double-blind studies, but all of this control and treatment is only good for simpler diseases, but not for very complicated things like quality of life.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Super fascinating. Before I close, Charles, did you want to ask any particular questions before I go to Jess? If he's online. Okay, let's leave Charles for the moment because we're going to have to turn to Jess now. But so Nikhil, once again, thank you so much for sharing and telling some of the work that you're doing, which is absolutely fascinating and really at the cutting edge of where we need to take all this science to really understand the human exposome. So I will obviously I will pick up with you, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that I know we're talking about. So I'll pick up with you after this call. But thank you so much, Nikhil. It's been super, super interesting.
Thank you, Tina. It's awesome to always interact with you.
All right, Nikhil. We'll say goodbye for now and bring on Jess. Thanks, Nikhil. Hi, Jess.
Hi.
Hi there. How are you?
So great. It's been so great to listen into these sessions. Thank you so much for organizing.
Oh, well, I'm glad you're able to listen in because there's so much fascinating. I mean, what I find so incredible, I mean, there's just so much amazing stuff happening all around us. And just we need to generate awareness about all the amazing research, all the stuff that needs to see, just get much greater recognition and awareness.
But something that's really been clear to me is that a lot of the things we need to do are going to be actually beneficial for human health and the health of nature and the planet, which I think is if they were kind of opposed, then that wouldn't be so good. But I think hopefully there are kind of benefits that we can convince everyone to work together and depending on what their area of expertise is for those kind of big goals.
Absolutely. And so really, I mean, obviously, Jess and I, we know each other through our shared interests in longevity and sort of what I call the new space of human flourishing, which is what I call the new frontier of longevity, how we need to understand what really makes humans and allows people to thrive, and then this comes down to positive environments, comes down to our psychology, our outlook on life. It's all these, spirituality. It's all these things that are really, really important. And now we're starting to get the science to really understand it. And of course, factors into this whole area of the human exposome. So really, really delighted you're here. So I've got a whole bunch of questions, and I know you've given me some questions. And so this is a conversation, but I think there's an enormous amount to unearth just from the sheer amount that you've been doing. So I'm going to start the questions. Is that okay, Jess?
Yeah, of course.
Excellent. So, well, for a start, tell us a little bit about you and how you got into this space, just generally in investing in human flourishing, because you're an impact investor. So just give us a little bit of a context and background, scene setting.
Yeah, of course. So I think I've been one of those people who's always had lots of different interests. I kind of am jealous of people who have just like one really clear route or route in American. I've done lots of different things. So I have a biology degree, and then I went into finance. So I became a chartered accountant, which is the kind of UK version of a CPA. And I worked in corporate finance at PwC. And I got the opportunity to work with a UK founder who'd exited his tech company and had lots of other kind of exited tech founder friends who wanted to support new entrepreneurs without kind of having to start a new company. So we would match make exited founders with newer, younger, kind of the next generation of founders in the UK, running an angel investor network. And that was about 10 years ago. So I kind of started learning about investment in general in the kind of startup space then. And then I went through actually like a big breakup, and I thought, okay, I want to kind of work on my personal development as well as like my kind of standard career development. So I did lots of, personal development courses, read like hundreds of books. I got really nerdy about it. And I met a guy who was running a business called Mind Unlocked, and he took me on as a co-founder. And we would basically do meditation and mindfulness, kind of small like retreats, company workshops, and an online meditation course as well, because I think meditation is such a pillar of health, really, or just kind of taking that mindful time to get beneath our busy minds. And I think as technology has become such a massive part of our lives, and like all the distraction that comes with it, actually being present is like really hard, like we kind of feel like we're being mindful when we like leave our phone in another room, it's kind of a bit extreme. So we realized how kind of important that was, but then how people were kind of fearful of meditation. Like they thought it was, you had to be a monk, or you had to go and like do it for an hour to get any benefits. But there have been found to be kind of mental health benefits after 10 minutes a day over 6 weeks. So anyway, I ran Mind Unlocked with him for a couple of years, and during the pandemic, I noticed kind of how difficult that was for everyone's mental health, and I wanted to start doing more kind of emotional well-being. So I started writing using kind of like research that I found online about how to stay connected, because I realized that we were all kind of together, but in our aloneness or in our isolation. So I started writing, and that's always been a love of mine, but I hadn't really done it professionally before then. And I started doing some coaching as well, and then my own investing kind of turned more into impact investing around kind of health and wellness, because that's just an area that I'm most interested in. So right now I'm doing a master's in psychology, because I realized that was really an area that I'm most interested in, kind of how we can improve the mental health of communities and society. And I'm also writing a book about the kind of like an antidote to the loneliness epidemic that we're experiencing like in so many countries around the world. And with kind of 5 different types of connection and practical ways that you can feel more connected and less isolated and lonely.
And of course, we just had a couple more questions about the book that you're writing, because of course we had the World Happiness Report that just came out really recently. Were you surprised by any of the outcomes? I mean, again, the top countries that, we know what tend to be the happiest countries, they tend to be the Nordic countries, but any observations on happiness, the state of the world in terms of happiness that you'll want to address in your book?
Well, I mean, country-wise, what kind of really stood out was, the countries that are the least happy. We say, money doesn't buy happiness, but, the countries that are experiencing very high levels of conflict, or a lack of freedom, or a lack of, option, like kind of economic options, they were understandably the ones that have the least happiness, which is really tragic. And so up to a certain point that we need to all have, then wealth and freedom and lack of conflict are clearly important. But looking at it from a kind of positive psychology side, I thought it was very sweet that the whole kind of topic of the reports was caring and sharing. So sort of talking about that, we have a general kind of reduction in the amount of quality in-person time that we're spending connecting with each other, and we sort of think that WhatsApp or Instagram or TikTok are kind of giving us a connection, but it's actually, there's something that we're lacking. Like, we haven't evolved to be connecting with a screen. Like, I'm sure there are so many things which we can't measure yet, but we will be able to measure that happen when we spend time together in one location.
Yeah, so really interesting. So I was just going to say, I did a sort of top line, so look at the happiness report, and of course the UK, and so the US has dropped, I think, to 24th place, a couple of places, and the UK are hovering at about 23rd, and I think has also dropped a bit. And these are like, two of the wealthiest countries in the world. So, this is the interesting piece. And I know the UK are looking at other measures of national success, like well-being measures, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all steps in the right direction. But to the point about social connections, and of course, we're going to speak about the story of Longevity Rave, and I know you've been to one of the raves, but a lot of that is absolutely to do with bringing people together and bringing serendipity back in our lives as well, because we've lost that, the chaotic connections, the things that you can't necessarily plan for. That is part of, the human experience, which I think is something that you do get in those environments where you're meeting different mixes of people, and it's all about serendipity and things like that. So it's kind of an interesting theme in this sort of, this digital world, that we feel we can control everything, but actually chaos and just sort of the bit of randomness and serendipity has actually been a story of many of generations before that we've kind of lost, So
I can, and that's actually, we're at Ocean Burn, and I've been to Burning Man a few times, and I think that's one of my favorite things about it is just that you can kind of wander off without a kind of set time that you need to be anywhere, and just see what happens, and it's always magic. And I think, and one thing I found interesting in that report was that it said that your perceived trust in other people, so whether you feel like other people are benevolent, that you might encounter during your day, it was actually really important for your happiness. So it wasn't just whether or not you could trust other people around you. So I think, being able to go out on a Saturday where you live and, feel like you might be able to meet new people and kind of be open to that. That is probably actually like a big part. We can kind of intuitively feel that would be enjoyable. And, and I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to, and I know there's so much to go through, and you've been so involved in the space, and I want to get on to that. So, so I was going to ask you the question. So, as an impact investor, what are the sorts of startups that you look for? And also, what are some of the really exciting companies that you've been involved with, invested in, et cetera, that you'd like to share?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So I first started off, as I said, I was kind of matchmaking these startups with exited founders. And so we were looking at a really broad range, mostly of consumer companies, because I didn't have enough knowledge for most of the kind of B2B companies that we would look at. But as a consumer, you can kind of think, okay, I sort of know that space as a potential customer. And so we kind of looked at a lot of European tech and consumer companies. And over the last few years, one thing that I'm also super passionate about is healthy, tasty food. And I think probably one of the, there's obviously like a big problem with the kind of the aliveness and the healthiness of kind of food in general. And then there's also another problem with affordability, of food that is healthy. It's kind of like, we have to pay a premium for things to not be toxic for us. I really, really hope that changes.
And if you looked at Nikhil's presentation, there's a whole section on all the, what we're eating. And, it's really interesting.
That's the exposome, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And we have to make those choices every day. It's a big part of our expenditure. So the last few years, I've really been interested in because I'm a big foodie and I'm a big fan of living kind of like healthily, but also not sacrificing like the tastiness that you can get from healthy food. So I started investing mostly in kind of healthy food and beverage companies. So some of them, I invested in one in the US called Theo's Plant-Based, which is a kind of a vegetable jerky that I actually went to Expo West last year in Los Angeles, which is a massive kind of healthy natural food and beverage convention, and they were giving out samples, and I was just like, wow, I can't believe this is only like beetroot or only sweet potato. It literally tasted like it was beef or something. And it's because one of the founders is a Michelin starred like ex-chef. So he's kind of made all these amazing sort of solutions to flavor it with. And they, I think like for me, a big aspect as well as it being tasty and healthy and not having lots of added ingredients, or a lot of the companies, especially in the US, have a lot of added sugar, even if it's something that's meant to be healthy. So, and I think that can get quite like dangerous for your health if you expect something's healthy, but actually it has as much sugar as like a slice of cake,
Well, we've got that same problem in the UK. I mean, we're eating way too much unhealthy food that is claiming to be healthy, and you're absolutely. And there needs to be much greater sort of regulation around that and appreciation.
Sort of like health washing, But a few of the companies like Theo's, they use vegetables that would have otherwise been kind of thrown out because they're not perfect, and they use the peel, they use like the whole vegetable to reduce waste.
Oh wow.
Another one is soul fruit, which just uses tropical fruits like dragon fruit, and they literally taste like candy. They're just kind of dried and chopped up, and they kind of do all the processing and packaging in tropical countries where they're grown, so that when you ship the dragon fruit, then dragon fruits are like 80% water, so you actually reduce a lot of the weight. So I found that a really kind of good sort of sustainable trend is that a lot of even like laundry detergents, for example, or like drinks companies are kind of trying to take the water out of their solutions, because if you're sending something halfway around the world and the consumer could actually just add water at where they're located, it makes much more sense from a cost and also a sustainability point of view.
Fascinating. So yes, I think really interesting background on some of the stuff that you've invested in. But so how, just bearing in mind the what we're discussing today, Human Exposome, obviously we're looking at the whole thread of plastic and on human health and obviously planetary health. So and I know we've got this sort of the blue economy sort of, I guess, area that I know you're looking at. Where do you think that's going, and where do you think some of the investable sort of propositions are going to come from?
So I think there's kind of a massive funding gap in the blue economy. It makes up the oceans make up 70% of the world's surface, and right now we use, I think it's nearly 50% of our land for growing or raising food, and the kind of food that feeds livestock and stuff like that. So if we can work out ways to more sustainably grow seaweed and as both a food for us as animal feed, it uses like inorganic fertilizer that runs off from other industries like fisheries and things like that. So it grows very fast. So that could kind of save a lot of land space as well, that we're using. But most of our crops that we grow are kind of monoculture cereals, which is pretty bad for the environment, and we use loads of pesticides. So we obviously have to be careful that we don't just repeat that in the oceans. So yeah, I think there are loads of different uses for seaweed. I've seen it being used as like a kind of biofuel, as like a carbon sink. People can use it as a kind of vegan leather. There are some companies doing that. So I think seaweed is a really interesting place where oceans and the kind of healthy food markets intertwine.
Really interesting. So I think, and you've mentioned a couple of funds actually, I think before in our conversation. There's groups like Catapult, Circulate Capital in the States. Do you think, and then of course the Blue Planet Fund, so there are some shifts that are starting to happen, aren't there, in terms of opening up access to money in this space?
Yeah, and I think especially if, I think the blue economy isn't as well understood because it's not as visible, it's not as explored. So I think if investors know that they want to make a big impact in this space, they can. And it can be, obviously you have to choose the fund carefully, and usually you give more capital to a fund than you would to an individual company. But it can kind of save time and kind of headache of really understanding the whole industry yourself by investing in funds. And Catapult's Ocean Fund, they have invested in 75 startups in this space, and they have an accelerator as well. So they try and really ensure that their startups have the best chance of succeeding. And the UK, as you mentioned, they have a Blue Planet Fund, which is kind of supporting projects in developing countries who are kind of working on protecting ocean habitats, and like protection is always or usually better than kind of trying to regenerate something that we've already destroyed. And that fund is £500 million, which is about $650 million, depending on the exchange rate. But yeah, there's still a big funding gap.
So how do you think that's going to, how are we going to open that up? Because obviously there is growing consumer awareness about, for example, the thing that we're looking at now, plastics in the oceans, the threat of, microplastics on that is entering the human body. How are we going to sort of grow awareness and the funding associated with that? And where do you think where do you think that's going?
I guess we can maybe look at industries that have already managed to raise more funding and like kind of copy their playbooks. I think that there needs to be better regulation, more publicity. I really hope that some kind of big institutional investors take this on as as like a mission, and family offices, and I'd rather that we protect this planet than like try and populate another planet, for example.
Exactly.
And,
yes.
But yeah, I guess, and I think we can see with like carbon credits, or we can see with a lot of publicity and research. I mean, there's so much research. It's like we know already what we need to do, but it's really, I think like maybe a lot of it comes down to as well, like realizing our connection to our environment. That's something that it's really been hitting me with everything I've learned, is that we feel so kind of separate from our environment, when really, if we pollute our food, we pollute our water, our air, then we're in that environment. We're literally made of that. So I think a lot of it is that separation.
Absolutely. And I think, obviously there's a lot of, I guess, angst in the tension that we're seeing, right now with the whole climate change agenda and the sort of all the criticism of ESG and the greenwashing. And then, of course, we've got this whole resurgence and going back to fossil fuels, and there's a whole kind of, climate change sort of, controversy, and, how great is the threat, that is being talked a lot about as well. I mean, so in a way, we're kind of at risk of kind of making a step backwards, if you look at some of the issues, sort of geopolitics and all the rest of it, as we know, and we dare I say more about that. But so I'm just wondering, I mean, to what extent do you think the consumer is the ones that are really going to call the shots on this? Because, the health and wellness industry is growing, and this is why we're seeing a huge kind of investment going into like the longevity space. The general public, the consumers are starting to really realize how important health is, to their lives. And, the link to climate, I think, is starting to get better recognized. Do you think that's the key to it? I mean, if we really want to make change, how are we actually going to address all these forces that are resisting change, but also harness the opportunity of really, real people kind of realizing, I'm going to have to kind of take this in my own hands. What are your thoughts on that?
I am one of those people who, I mean, to be honest, we have instances in our lifetimes of changes that have been made. Even, recently the Tesla share price halved, because people started kind of boycotting it and, doing all sorts of things against Tesla. And I think individual opinions can make a difference, especially with social media these days. You know, you can start a movement with a post that goes viral and other people are like, hey, actually, you can kind of feel when something has a deep truth to it. Yeah, I just hope people who are better than me at social media can start spreading this message.
I know, I'm still getting to grips with Instagram. That's my newest.
But I do think, you know, that groups of motivated people, you know, a lot of people make this their life's work, whatever area it is. But it's one of the reasons why I'm studying psychology, is because I think actually human consciousness and you know, even like meditation and stuff like that, getting towards what you feel like is a deep truth and getting below the busyness and everything is really important.
Yeah, and so I want to kind of close, I guess, our discussion more around this, all this, because it is about, yes, I think the connectedness, you know, humans and their environments, you know, nature, these are all really, really important, kind of feeling more connected and I guess more empowered to actually make changes in your local environment as well. I mean, that it all you know, things, you know, can start small and then spread, you know, and this is what we see with social media and all the rest of it. But tell us a little bit more about that, because, you know, and these are, I know, the themes that you're exploring, you know, in your book as well, but I think are also the themes that we'll be picking up on with the next couple of guests who are going to be coming on, in terms of creating the environments, you know, where you are engaging people in their environments, in their communities, to actually really create those positive spaces where flourishing can really happen. So tell us a little bit more about that and those themes in your book, because I think that's really, really interesting.
So my book, it kind of came about because I just realized a lot of the things that I've been writing about when I was posting on my blog or the wellness publications and things like that, was around connection to different, like, to nature, or to how to find a romantic relationship, how to follow your intuition, things like that. And as I said, during the pandemic, I realized kind of how isolated we were. And, you know, social isolation is an objective measure of how much time we're spending alone or with other people. But loneliness is kind of that gap between how much time and the quality of our connections that we would like versus how much we're actually having. It's that kind of deficit between our kind of our actual and our desired amount of connection. So it just kind of came to me that if you look at kind of your connection to yourself, your connection to your close relationships, your connection to the broader community, connecting to the environment, which I've counted as both the human-made environment, nature, and technologies in the human-made environment as well, and then also connecting something bigger than yourself. So whether that's intuition, purpose, spirituality, I think, you know, we live in individualistic societies in, you know, a lot of the Western world, and I think it's making us like pretty unhappy. And
you also speak to women, to bringing in more of the women, the female touch and all this, you know, sort of this, you know, which tend to be associated with sort of female behavior and sort of characteristics. Say a little bit more about that.
I think, well, I think for all people, you know, I like to think of it, the masculine, feminine energy that we all have. And I think the kind of more feminine characteristics which men and women both, you know, exhibit, like, you know, as I said, following your intuition, being nurturing, you know, being kind of free flow, creative, all that kind of stuff has been less valued and kind of suppressed. And, you know, there are some countries where, like Afghanistan, for example, where it's really, really like illegal to display a lot of those characteristics publicly. And I think it's very interesting. Like, one thing I've been writing about is how it's almost like that hyper masculinity is kind of coding itself out of a job. So with AI, you know, that comes in and does a lot of knowledge work, like accountant work and for lawyers and all that kind of stuff. Then we're actually left with that kind of the in-person or kind of jobs. You know, like you would probably want a nurse to be a real person. You would probably still go and see a kind of live performer, you know, a kind of musician. So I think it's very interesting like which jobs will actually be valuable, in the future as AI becomes bigger as well.
Absolutely. This has been absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for Jesper for coming on and sharing with us your philosophies and also just your amazing work and the investments that you've done and also are looking to do in this whole new space of human flourishing, the new frontier of longevity, as I call it. So thank you so much, and I hope you can hang on for, if you can, to the other two presentations, but if not, completely understand, because we're moving into really looking at those environments for human flourishing and creating that positivity that we all need in our lives. So I'm going to hand over to Laurence and Alexey, both of whom I know well, who are behind the genesis and sort of making it all happen around Viva City. So they're going to share with us a little bit about what Viva City is all about. I know Alexey from the longevity space. He was one of my DJs at the first Longevity Rave, which was amazing, and it was great to have him there. And of course, Laurence, I know just again through being part of the network, and of course he came to the Longevity Rave in San Francisco, so that was great to see him there. So over to you. I'm going to let you take the stage. You're going to tell us about what you're hoping to achieve with Viva City, how it feeds into this whole concept of creating those environments for human flourishing. And I think you've got some stuff you want to show and tell first before we go into a conversation. But over to you.
Yeah, I was thinking it would be a good idea to do a 5-minute quick presentation.
Sure.
People have some visuals as well.
Amazing. So I think all you need to do is you need to just press the share button, and it should be fairly self-explanatory. And if not, we'll have Danielle or Charles Ocean Fox tell us what to do. But I can see Alexey there. There's Laurence. Yes. So if you share your screen, then it should be self-evident. There's a button there.
Yeah, I'm going through it.
Excellent. Good to have you both.
So, I hope everyone here loves life and wants to be healthy and live longer lives. I think I need to give permission for screen sharing somehow.
Okay, so let's bring in Charles. Charles or Danielle, if you can hear us, can you help us with the screen share facility? Tell us what to do.
So you press the share button there at the bottom.
I just need to I need to enter from this other browser that has permission. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Maybe Alexey can give an intro on himself.
Sure.
Also, just make sure your soul cam you in a circle, Alexey.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
There we go. Amazing.
Great. Yeah, so Alexey,
yes,
you start while Laurence is figuring out the screen share.
Yeah, I think he's probably
Yeah, good to be invited here. Microplastics, I see is I have totally rage against microplastics as well.
Good. You're in the right place.
Yeah. Happy to see everyone. We really want to do something that we can to live healthy and long lives. And we tried to do companies, we tried to do movements, we tried to do funds, we tried to do DAOs, and now we're doing a city. So we tried very different approaches to solve aging. And yeah, I think Laurence has fixed.
We fixed. Technology has been conquered.
Can you do it a little bit larger?
You have to click the little icon, and then it'll expand.
Scroll.
Yes. Scroll to the top.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, Viva Oceanburn.
Laurence, you might want, Laurence, if you can get yourself into a circle, so you want to be on circle cam.
and see how you can tap into blue circles.
Yes, I can also do that.
So not the square picture. There you go.
Excellent.
Amazing.
Now it looks it looks symmetrical now.
Great. Yeah, so Viva Ocean Burn. We are building a city to make death optional because life is so awesome. Everyone talks about health being the most important thing, right? But it's quite abstract usually. I am sort of lucky to have been born with a genetic disease and know what it's like to lose your health, to spend a lot of time in hospitals and have a lot of surgeries all across my childhood, and have all these joint pains and feel old and frail. And I know I don't want it to get worse. A healthy man has 1,000 wishes. Sick man has only one wish. So I want to make sure that everyone is present to what's most important, right? Health. And nobody wants to end up like this and when you're old and in a hospital bed. And I would actually also say you don't want to end up sort of like healthy aging, so you kind of can still move around and so on, but you're like this. What you really want is this. If you know the movie In Time with Justin Timberlake, where he presents his daughter, his wife, and his mother, right? They all look in peak optimal health, and they're young, right? Everyone can be young. So drugs that target aging are the future of medicine. Instead of managing symptoms and keeping people in a poor state of health for longer, we can address the root cause and actually prevent or reverse or stop and maybe even cure diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, and so on. And it has been done in mice where we slowed or reversed aging with dozens of pharmaceutical interventions. And people think, well, there's these diseases and then there's like aging where you have frailty, muscle loss, vision loss, and so on. But actually, aging is the root cause, and they're the same phenomenon. And it's economically unsustainable. The current situation is that we have more people over 65 than people under 5. And these kids under 5, they're in the developing nations. So you have this inverted pyramid that's unsustainable. It's going to collapse. We need to do something else, actually rejuvenate people instead of paying for taking care of them with Medicare. We can actually have them be healthy and contribute to this, just flipping the equation. So what we want, of course, is to extend that healthy part of life. And of course, as a side effect, ideally we keep the part and death part at bay without any limit. And humans can coordinate to achieve amazing things, like going to the moon. So I think we should stop fucking around and actually coordinate to do this moonshot and cure aging. And as a member of VitaDAO, one of the founding members of this online community, I know that we can sort of, as a by the people, for the people, in a scalable way, coordinate at a major scale to, for example, here, funding dozens of projects with millions of dollars, community of over 10,000 members. One of our projects was ready for clinical trials and realized how big of a bottleneck overregulation is. We need to exit the status quo where there's an invisible graveyard, people dying, waiting for medicine that could have saved their lives. I make this metaphor of it's akin to having the speed limit at 4 miles an hour, and anyone who proposes to increase it is like, oh, what do you want people to die? Well, there should be a balance, right? Because the status quo is that people die from aging, 110,000 people every day, and we do need to hurry up. And also, we can keep the rigor on safety, just move all the unnecessary, irrelevant, irrational, bureaucratic things. And I also appreciate that a lot of people are using their voice to reform the current system, but it may be too little, too late. I don't want to wake up in 20 years and we're still in the system. So I'm working on a hedge. Maybe 20% of our efforts should be on creating a new system in parallel, a sandbox where we can try out a new regulatory framework. And there's this amazing emergent property. As a lot of people live together, we are a community, we have this leverage that we can actually legitimately self-govern, to self-experiment, create our own laws and regulations, and try out new frameworks for regulation. So my dream is that we can have a sort of warp speed effort instead of the warp speed effort for COVID, which, it was a crisis because there's a new virus. And people are like, whoa, this is an emergency. Well, Alzheimer's, heart disease, and cancer, each one of these are like bigger crises. More people die. Just because they've been around for a while doesn't mean it's not a crisis. So I propose warp speed, at least in a special jurisdiction, Viva City, where we can bring drugs to market on the order of a few months and $1 million instead of decades and billions of dollars. And new people have built new cities to solve a crisis with science, like Los Alamos with the Manhattan Project. And then there's also this idea of a network state, where you have an online community that's aligned for collective action, like VitaDAO. Then it would crowdfund territory and maybe gain diplomatic recognition as a new type of state. But how do you get from an online community to there? So Vitalik Buterin, founder of Ethereum, has put this idea forth. So you have an online community, there's some steps in between to actually having a new society. So let's experiment. Let's try out gathering people in a scale 10 times larger than co-living space. So it's doable. And 10 times longer duration than a conference, so that it feels like you're kind of living there, but it's also not too long, and see what happens. So with Zozalo, we brought 200 people for 2 months in a close proximity in Montenegro about 2 years ago, and it was life-changing. We had healthy food, tracked our biomarkers, exercised together, explored these ideas. How would it feel like to live here for long term and build a new type of city? And so after the online community, maybe you do a pop-up, see how it feels like, and see if people would want to live there. But then what? How do you get to a permanent society? So we did our first permanent Longevity City attempt. We went to an already existing special jurisdiction on Roatan, and we already welcomed companies to come and create novel therapeutics, gene therapies, for example, that are already in humans. But that didn't work out. So now with Viva City, we are looking for a new location all over the world, talking to various governments to establish such a new jurisdiction, and then we'll do pop-ups there as well. But meanwhile, we are gathering people in existing major cities like San Francisco. There's the Frontier Tower. We're partnering to fill up this tower in June, July with a pop-up and have it as a permanent hub with all the frontier technologies like longevity, crypto, AI, neuroscience, even arts and music to have culture. We will have third space, co-working, and eventually co-living as well. Also, very soon, you might have heard about Vitalis Bay in the Bay Area and Berkeley, a mini village there that's going to bring in all the vitalists of the world, people that really believe that life is good and death is bad, and we should dedicate significant resources to this. So we're partnering with them to also bring people in Vitalis Bay, and then hopefully in LA around July, August, we are looking for a new location in LA as well, because our previous venue burned down. So I'd love to please reach out if you are in LA or know someone that can help us find the new location. And you have two options, right? You can work with us on curing aging, or option two, random fun side project. With option 1, the cool part is you can do more. With option 2, you're dead. So I very much prefer option 1, where we can do as many projects as we want, see the future. So I would love for each and every one of you to at least do something, some action, however small, to help with this movement. So we have this private Telegram where we're going to coordinate and collect, whether you can do something so big as to move to Viva City when we have a location, or at least come to one of the pop-ups or permanent hubs all over the world, or maybe even just meet up, maybe become an online member, or even just the small thing as like retweeting something when we have an important announcement that we want more of the world to hear about every few weeks or something. Please sign up and join if you don't want to die.
Wow. Amazing. Thank you so much, Laurence. And of course, I feel like I've been a little bit on this journey with you, because I was at Zuzalu, and of course I was also on Roatan, and I haven't yet made my way to what you're doing, obviously in California, but really, really interested to see what comes out of that. I've got a few questions, but Alexey, did you want to have your say on? Because you're out. Are you out there at the moment?
I'm here in San Francisco.
So Laurence, you're out. Yes, you're out there, but is Alexey out there? Oh, he's sort of stuck, I think. Anyway, we'll move on to Alexey in a second. I've got a few questions.
Yeah. So we'd love to just discuss interaction.
Sure. So, and Alexey, just pop in if you can. So yeah, so I guess so of all the sort of the experiments, and you mentioned this idea of the sandbox, which is a really good way of describing it, and hopefully getting the leverage from the community that will obviously inspire the change. What have you taken as learnings from the previous sort of pop-ups, Zuzalu, Roatan, that you're taking into this new concept that you're doing now?
So with Zuzalu, it's just like, okay, how does it feel like to live together? And then on Roatan, we had a special jurisdiction. In Montenegro, the idea was that we would have a special jurisdiction, and it's being worked on. Then with Roatan, I would say the learning was, yes, people want to move to such a place, people especially focus on longevity, because Zuzalu was more general frontier technologies, using crypto for governance and AI and longevity as well. But with Vitalia, it was just longevity focused. Of course, using tools as crypto and AI, but it was just like filtered for people that do want to live longer. Then the learning there, I would say, is that pretty obvious that you want to add value to the local community as well.
Yeah.
Even though legally Prospera had a jurisdiction and stability for 50 years, the locals were not happy. They weren't seeing the value, right? So the Supreme Court of Honduras declared it as unconstitutional, and the fight goes on to potentially undo that or just allow the jurisdiction to continue. But what we know is that we can bring in a lot of prosperity to the local community. We can show, of course, have income sharing, ideally direct the dividends to the people that live in that country, where they feel they're getting a check that is small, but like then gets bigger and bigger. And apart from that, they also have some kind of share. In crypto communities, you have this idea of an airdrop, right, where you bring in your community with you. It's instead of like having 100% of the pie for yourself, rather maybe have 80% of the pie, but then it's bigger. Because if you have 100% of something that then gets shut down, it's
sure,
useless.
There's nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to jump in and add the learnings of like, first, it was absolutely amazing to live together with like-minded people. It's the best experience of my life. I've been to several pop-up cities. And I want to, what if I could live somewhere like that permanently? And then, like 10 years ago, I also worked in a special economic zone and lived there. And again, like I even have a specific bias that like I perceive humanity a little bit better than it actually is, to be honest, in my opinion. But like living amongst like-minded people is absolutely wonderful. Yeah, I think that, and if you assemble a large enough crowd of smart people, they self-organize. So that's what I learned as well, and that was kind of like in the beginning it looked a little bit chaotic, and it felt there is no specific guidance or team. But like when you come there, things just happen. Like people just, okay, well, let's do it. And that's important. And they kind of self-organize and collaborate on building something together. So I think that this is super important. And if we scale it to a larger city, I can't even imagine how cool it would be.
So fascinating. And so I've got a couple of other questions. So obviously you've got Frontier Tower, Vitality Bay, Bloom City. So these are all, I guess, these are existing structures that you're sort of plugging into. Is that correct? That, to create these communities. Is that how it's...
The goal is, I mean, while we're looking for this location to bring people all over the world in such pop-ups or even permanent hubs like the Frontier Tower. Even with Bloom City, the idea is to have a permanent hub. With Vitalist Bay, maybe it will be a permanent hub too. So we're partnering with teams all over the world. We're working with 9 other leaders in 9 other cities. So my hope is that this is going to be super scalable. We can't do it all ourselves, so we're just partnering with people building similar things.
So really the aspiration then is to really create what you said yourself, sort of these more sort of permanent communities that have a chance to kind of, obviously, come together but grow
Any major city you go to, you feel like, okay, there's a home for longevity. Like I go to a place where I know there's healthy food, there are like-minded people, there's co-working, there's, people are exercising, people are working on companies that build towards this mission, whether longevity biotech companies or whether more things like, using crypto for a new type of health insurance or AI for, getting people to share their health data or whatever.
Yeah, no, and I guess the other thing, just to, have you had to deal with any potential sort of criticism in the sense that, you're appealing to obviously a certain type of individual who obviously very motivated by their health and like forming these communities. I mean, how do you take on, the whole kind of question around inclusivity and diversity, to make sure that these communities are giving back? Because that was obviously one of the learnings, how do you really give back to, maybe pre-existing communities, but also make sure that you are, not just effectively a gated community? Because that, so what's your sort of response to all that?
I'm not worried at all because we are creating we're creating technologies, therapies that will help everyone. Everyone ages and gets diseases, and the goal is to not have any diseases. So, this is going to benefit everyone, and it's not going to be even a cost. It's actually going to be a negative cost to society, to the individual, to governments, to everyone, right? It's instead of paying for taking care of the disease, you actually not only don't not have to pay, but you get the benefit of them being healthy and around and contributing more. Now, of course, communities, at least initially, are more private, invite only, and so on. But when you have a bigger city, it will just be able to take in a lot more people and a lot less filtering. I think filtering is a lot more strict at the beginning. You don't want to scale too fast. But then it gets more loose.
Absolutely. So I guess, and then I guess another question is going back to actually the economics. I mean, because we've got, obviously we've got a new government. There's the whole kind of make America healthy again. The environment for being able to do these sorts of things. Is it becoming easier or more difficult? Because obviously we know that the current, government are very, and I'm talking obviously from the US perspective, are very committed to, crypto and that whole sort of, I mean, do you see it getting easier to do the sort of stuff that you're doing in this new environment?
Yeah, there's a lot of excitement. So I would even love to do something inside the US. there's this, Trump came up with the Freedom Cities thing a while ago, and pretty similar to these ideas of charter cities and free cities. And there are ways to actually create a jurisdiction inside the U.S. where it's a sandbox outside of the federal regulations, FDA, and so on. But that's probably going to be hard to sustain because the whole country, by bringing in, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, you're changing their lives in a small or poor countries. Like for them, it's a huge deal. For something like the U.S., it's maybe not so clear what your value is directly short term if people don't really believe in the innovation of longevity biotech.
So I guess you've introduced the next question that I was going to ask. So a lot of this is in the context of sort of, I guess, the kind of the biotech model of longevity. But how far are you looking at? Because I mean, I know you do lots of amazing things from a community level in terms of keeping active and all these sorts of things, which are also really, really important, which actually drives our biology as well as at the heart of a lot of the stuff that we're covering off in this whole idea of the human exposome, where we know that there's, these wider stresses, how we move, what we eat, obviously even now, the microplastics issue, these are all, and of course, air quality, which we covered quite a lot, and actually you yourself mentioned, LA, I mean, it literally, the building would burn down. This is climate change, fires, all these sorts of things. They are actually really starting to impact. So I guess, to what extent is your vision for what you're trying to do kind of reaches into this space of this exposome territory? Like, is that something that's on your radar yet, or are you looking at it, or do you know what I mean?
It's kind of early.
Yes.
Right. So of course I'm super interested. Yeah. But it's not a focus yet.
Yeah.
As we need to prioritize.
So I'm going to ask maybe my last question to Alexey is because I know you were one of the co-authors of the Nature Medicine paper. We had Ben Johnson, the editor, who was here earlier on the program, who obviously was very supportive of what we were trying to do, the need for the Human Exposome Project. There's the Exposome Moonshot that's meeting for the first time in May in Washington, D.C. to kind of take what we had with the Human Genome Project to the next level, the Human Exposome Project. And I know, Alexey, a lot of our conversations have been around, the test bed to kind of research this. And I know this was referenced, obviously, in the paper of which you're a co-author as well. I mean, do you see this, we know examples like, for example...
Tina, I really want to make sure your question. So, Tony, hi.
Oh, no, I see Tony. I'm just going to close this session, and then I'll bring you guys on. Is that okay?
Because he's not on the circle cam, so it's...
We'll bring him on in a second. Yeah. I'll bring him on in a second when we close the session.
Your circle cam, because otherwise the recording is going to have his square picture. So I just want to make sure we capture this last part visually right. So Tony, if you can turn on your circle cam and find open circles there, that way we can get a really good recording of this these closing of this section.
Tony, do you want to do that?
Yes. What do I need to do? Tell me.
You just need to move. You need to press circle cam on your screen.
Mm-hmm.
Circle cam.
Yeah, and then you'll go right there. Fantastic. Thanks, Steph. So just to finish off, and we'll send Tony on in a second. So that's great. So yes, just to finish off with the last question, because I know some of the discussion in the Nature Medicine piece was about how we can use these communities, use this, this concept of the city, whatever scale it is, to become test beds, to really understand human flourishing, which I know we're going to cover off a lot with our discussion next to Steph and also Tony. Any of that sort of thinking kind of going into the pot, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. Laurence said it's a little bit too early because we are still looking for a physical jurisdiction, and a lot will depend on where the physical jurisdiction will be. How, is it close to a large city? Is it close to an ocean? A lot of variables which it's just not that sensible to think about in advance. But of course, on the next step, we will actually do everything that we know, all the best practices, all the healthy best practices that we know in building the city and the community. Because like we aspire to build something biotech-wise, but we really, and we hope the progress will be fast, but we're really not sure. Whereas with Exposome and all of lifestyle best practices, you can add decades today, probably like decade or 15 years or so. And it's definitely viable, and we of course need to do that. And we also plan to collect a lot of data, including a lot of medical data from the residents, but of course the data from the Exposome community can benefit from as well. So yeah, of course we're thinking about it.
Great.
At least we, in terms of me, try to think once about it. Okay.
Fantastic. So we're going to close there, and I'll pick up with you, obviously, on involving you in the Exposome Moonshot if you guys are interested, because they're meeting for the first time in May and what have you. So there's all sorts of stuff going on which we can talk about. But listen, thank you so much, Laurence and Alexey, for joining us and for sharing your vision and what you're doing. It's super fascinating, and I hope I will be able to go out there and experience it for myself soon. And good luck with it. And so thank you so much for joining. And so we're going to now move into the next phase of our discussions today. So we're going to be bringing in, for the next hour, we're going to first bring in Steph and then Tony, and they will both explain what they're up to and share with us, what their plans are for creating environments for human flourishing, and obviously moving into this whole next frontier of longevity, which and we'll move into sort of the power of music and so forth, sort of towards the end of today. So I'm going to hand over to Steph. So Steph, did you want to share and tell a little bit first, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing.
I first want to also just set the stage, give everyone an introduction of my journey, because then I think it will make a lot of sense why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Absolutely.
And why it's important to me personally. Because as we know, community and purpose, I always say this, that these are two very underrated and often missing pieces of longevity. So and what that looks like for myself, I started my career in finance. So working with families and asset managers, managing wealth and as well investment solutions. So ultimately that morphed into sustainable investing, impact investing. And at one point I felt similar to Jess's journey, I would say. I also started writing a book on community and purpose, and alluding to the different challenges that we would face as part of this human flourishing puzzle, what that would look like at each stage. And I could only speak to so many stages. So, but it's essentially for the millennials and Gen Zs rising up to a certain age, the challenge of loneliness, for example, that's a huge one. So then realized, okay, through a very personal experience, I realized who am I to want to save the world through impact investing, through sustainable investing. I was really looking for that purpose, that burning desire to be part of something larger than life, than myself. Then there was a life event where it really knocked me down. I had to be honest to myself and say, who am I to want to save the world when I can't even save somebody I love? And, that's the true moment of clarity, when that pain and passion, they merge, and what came beautifully out of that, I guess, darkness is this light, this hope that, okay, wow, actually, I've been managing wealth for a decade, but health is something that wealth cannot buy. And what if
I devote myself completely to health, which is health and longevity, which is the next frontier of humanity, at least in my mind, and for a lot of us as well. And then over the past 2 years of being longevity, I had this crazy idea of creating what we call the Silicon Valley 2.0, or this is me again coining it, the Longevity Valley. And I really see that with everything morphing, once again evolving around me, I really see that sitting in Switzerland for various reasons. And I think this is a good segue for us to also, I would love to present.
Wonderful.
Possible.
Because you've got a whole new concept for the city of the future, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and it's actually, I might need to get permission to be able to share my screen.
So Danielle will be able to help here.
Okay.
So Danielle, if you can help us, Steph, share her screen. I think it's about, so you...
Everyone should be able to. Yeah.
Okay, let me refresh then. Maybe that could
be it, yeah.
Oh, well, this one. Yeah.
So it says that share my screen is off for some reason, which is
that's weird.
A shame. Hold on, let me try again.
Because it's been working for other people. It's strange, isn't it?
Huh.
Check if you have a pop-up blocker. Sometimes that affects the screen share thing. Or if you don't have a screen recording on. Yeah, there should be a arrow like right next to the camera. It says microphone, camera, share.
Yeah, share. It's when I click on it, it's not letting me share. But that's okay. I'm very happy to speak to what that would look like. So there's also, beyond the physical location, what we want to focus on is bring together a community at the intersection of longevity science as well, and a hospital, not a hospital-like experience, but instead a hospitality-like experience that feels and soulful and actually people want to go to. And so that is the first layer of what we're calling a longevity collective or community, and that is global. That is a platform for knowledge sharing, exactly as some of the earlier previous speakers had alluded to. There is a huge need for interdisciplinary collaboration, for scientists to start talking to policymakers. And how we make that happen is through these platforms, digitally and in person. So what's unique about our community is that there's a physical space right now being built in a future pop-up city, and I really wish I could share the visual, but what that will look like is a science resident program at a future city where you would also have access to wellness biohacking facilities. And there, the scientists are focused on developing the most cutting-edge technologies that are enabling human flourishing. Meanwhile, we're also designing the entire environment to be ideally suitable to human flourishing. So a lot of the points that we spoke on earlier, air, water, food, etc., everything that Tina full-time advocates for, Human Exposome, we look to bring a lot of those elements as much as possible to this first kind of we call it a pop-up. In the meantime, we're also building, so that is our scientific kind of engine. I usually make the analogy of a car. So we need this, Aeon Labs is so our brand is called House of Aeon. Aeon Labs is the research engine that powers the innovation, the science, that, together with Tina and the International Institute of Longevity, that's what we really hope to promote. And ultimately, we would also, out of the science residency program, we would also have an incubator program to help these innovation startups commercialize, because there is also a bridge that needed to, we see a gap for us to complete. And then this thought on policymakers. So because of its strategic location, very close to Davos, we foresee an opportunity for us to also establish a longevity house there. And that's where a lot of the dialogues with the policymakers can happen. And that vision specifically would be great to have all of your support. It's not the core offering of House of Aeon, but I think it's strategically very important for all of us to start something like that at the place, an event where most of the world leaders are in participation. And thirdly, we are anticipating the opening of a longevity sanctuary. That is a retreat space that in the Swiss Alps, once again. With this, our goal really, and I heard these same words being spoken by Jess earlier, it's an opportunity for us to connect within, with each other, with nature, and really ground back to what's important to us as humans. Sure, we can optimize our physical health. We can optimize the environments that we live in. The connective tissue here really is the sense of purpose and community. And going beyond mental health, the idea of self-actualization, what that looks like, and that's an entire journey, right? And everyone's on their own journey. So we really hope to curate programs and experiences that fit their needs specifically and take them perhaps as they're embarking on their health journey, first through the phase of physical optimization, then through to mental and emotional optimization, finally to discovering the meaning of life, of their purpose, of human connectedness. So all of these aspects are working together. This is an ecosystem. I don't see longevity as only science or only environmental sustainability or human exposome in itself in silo, but all of these disciplines coming together, and wellness and consciousness and relationship with each other, with nature. These all contribute to behavioral changes and kind of neurological changes that will continuously happen even when you leave the retreat, the event, back into your, I guess, normal routine, right? So how do we create long-lasting, positive changes, shifts in people, even when they're not part of this Future City project, even when they're not part of, even when they're not living in an environment like Switzerland, even in cities like London, where I'm currently resided, I would love to see a space like that, an urban sanctuary, in the middle of London or New York. And that's actually our more immediate mission. We're looking to secure a commercial property in one of the major urban hubs where people spend most of their times when they're working and looking, and really retreat into that space and find time. So one of the exciting pop-up events that we are doing in collaboration with Tina, with House of Cocoa, is prototyping that, meaning we would have an afternoon and day at night of longevity programs, events, bring science together with some of the experts in the wellness world as well, giving context to people what are the science-backed, data-driven facts that's really helping them achieve optimal health through the more wellness, what we call wellness, spiritual events that they are participating in. So, breath work, we all know about the power of mindfulness, of air, of simply, just creating that space to ourselves. Later from Tony, we'll hear about healing, the music, the power of frequencies. So all of these are proven scientific facts that they continue to help us from thousands of years ago to today. It's just it needs to be communicated in a way that people have the context, can understand, and can tangibly say, okay, wow, so this is why I go to sound bath and I feel so good. And this is why I started doing meditation every day, and all of a sudden my whole world's shifted. Providing the scientific context is also important, because then when we communicate with researchers and, say, policymakers, investors, they want to see numbers. They want to be able to see data. Not just feelings and emotions. That's not convincing enough for them to make the right decisions. So I think, I've been having this monologue for a while now.
I'm going to ask a few questions.
Yes.
and others can pop in if they want, but I've definitely got a few.
Exactly. That's exactly. I'm very happy to.
Should I ask a few questions, and then I'll bring Tony, and then you carry on, because I know it's amazingly, the time has absolutely flown by. I can't believe we've had such an enriched session for almost 4 hours now. But I've got a few questions, and certainly if others want to chip in, do let me know. But so I've got a few questions, and I know we know each other from the ecosystem. And of course I know Tony and Steph, you've been to Longevity Raves. We're all very bound about the power of music ourselves, etc. But a couple of questions just about the vision that you have for what you're doing with Aeon is the time scale was my first question. Where do you expect your first residence? And do you see this kind of like as a permanent fixture, or is it a series of experiments that you're hoping to sort of look at and create and sort of see that more of a sandbox where people come in and go? So that was my first sort of, just to get a bit more detail around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So all of this, great questions, because all of these are would have been on my slides. So we follow a multi-hub strategy, and as I mentioned, the first Aeon Labs, that's the pop-up in the future city, that is coming to the world in the third quarter of this year, so Q3 2025. That's something that we're actively working on. And the flagship social longevity club in London, potentially, that's coming to us in the first quarter of 2026. And we're also in conversation with a real estate developer in Monaco to collaborate on a residential offering that means that we would not only have a House of Aeon location in the building itself, but also hope to design together with the architects and interior designers how to optimize the residential spaces so they're I guess longevity or healthy homes. And then 2 years from now, at least. So let's say end of 2027. And then finally, by end of 2028, we should be opening our longevity sanctuary and retreat space in Zermatt. And so, yeah, each year there's a big milestone. And in the meantime, we're also constantly open to exploring new locations, strategic partners that have an interest in our project and want to be part of this mission. We would love to create the largest community of, like-minded individuals who understand that longevity isn't just about adding years, but enriching life itself. To live well, experience vitality and joy through every stage of life. And we want to empower our community, everyone, to be able to do that. That would be our mission.
Fantastic. And I've got one more question, fairly quick one. It seems that a lot of what you're doing is quite distinct in the sense that you really are focusing on the whole kind of like psychological, emotional, spiritual element of feeding into your whole concept, which is a bit, and I'm not saying that, for example, with this previous session like Viva City, etc. I mean, they're also interested in that, but it seems that that's a core point of differentiation. I don't know if it's because the Europeans have a different sort of take on this, because we know the US is much more biomedically focused, and all that I know is changing with us. We go learn more about the exposome, which is part of the point of it. But just a little bit, and then I'll move on to Tony.
Perfect. Yeah, great question. Because we see a gap, actually, the reason why we created this is because we see a gap between very clinical experiences and hospitality. And then in the middle, there's also above both, there's longevity science. So we are actually taking longevity science and putting a hospitality experience together rather than a clinical experience. And what sets us apart really is our philosophy of ancient futurism, where that's reflected both in our architectural design, which I wish I would be able to show you, and together with everything that we do is backed by science. That is also one of our core differentiators. Even though we talk a lot about, the terms such as consciousness, wellness, we want everything that we do and communicate to be highly science-backed and data-driven, and that is the superpower of Aeon Labs. This is why it's important for me to have the House of Cocoa event, for example. Everything that we do cannot feel like just wellness. It needs to be science-backed health and wellness. So that is the core. That's the bridge I really want the gap we really want to close, and that hopefully answers your question to be our unique positioning.
Fantastic. No, that's super helpful and really, really interesting. I'm so looking forward to sort of learning more about it as we sort of go through the journey ahead, so to speak. That coming up, including the House of Cocoa event, which is going to be very exciting. But so thank you so much, Steph. And so so I know you know Tony as well, Steph, and so really happy that Tony is here because
good to see you.
And you were both at the Longevity Rave that began in London at the Love Shack with Charles, and of course Yukari, who's going to come on later. So it's good to see you. So Tony, I'm gonna basically You've got the floor, but obviously I know the interesting kind of, I guess, philosophy of, you've been looking at this whole field of longevity and seen it through a slightly different lens. So just wanted to, for you to share that. And of course, some of your really interesting research that you're also engaging with around heart rate variability and all that sort of stuff. So over to you, Tony.
Well, hi everyone. And first of all, thank you, Tina, for having me. And for inviting me to speak in these events. I'm very, very grateful for that.
Thank you.
And so my background has been in music since forever, I think. I started music when I was 4, so it's something that I think I have in my DNA. And I started my life as a composer, as a normal composer, blending classical with electronic music. But I think that I always had an intent of my music being some sort of healing or transcendental. I always had an intent for my music to be somehow transformative, but I never intended anything or even I was thinking about any kind of application that could transcend the artistic domain. Just through the years and as we go through life and life gives you challenges and you are in need of healing is when you start doing your personal journey of learning about things that you need for your own journey to heal yourself, things that Western medicine cannot offer. And this is when I entered the field of biohacking, longevity, and health. And I tried to find a way that I could possibly merge my artistic practice with this interest of mine. But I'd say that artistically, my music always was trying to connect people with some sort of higher power, as we can call it in different names. And as you've discussed here today, besides of course the different supplements and biohacking techniques and all things we can do to prolong life, one of the most important things is connectivity with others, connection with others. And music historically was created for that. The thing is, only on the 20th century, music became a commodity that could be sold. So the music industry appeared. But that's super recent if you look at the history of mankind. Music historically for thousands of years was designed for connection, both connection with others, that was very important as well to create community, but also this connection within yourself, you know. So I think that that's where I'm working towards. And in terms of my music practice. And then I'm an academic too. I teach music technology and sound technology at Imperial and the London College of Music. And I'm doing a PhD where I'm exploring a different avenue of music and longevity, which is exploring, we're taking music not as music as organized sounds that create artistic practice, but music as sound, purely as sound, and how sound can biohack part of the body to increase health and well-being. And my particular aspect is HRV, which is a very popular biomarker, which is a very reliable biomarker to measure physical and mental health. So in a way, how to use sound to entrain these rhythms of the body. So forget about music, about I like music or I dislike music, but in a way, purely physical reaction of the body to frequencies and rhythms, and how the body, regardless of your culture, your background, your ethnicity, entrains those rhythms, and how we can use music as medicine, you know, with the aim of using it as a tool to actually prolong life, besides of this journey, as I mentioned, of kind of inner and outer connectivity.
Super interesting. And so what stage are you at with your research? And of course, because I'm familiar with some research already that's obviously been published, and there's even some apps that are out there, like, I don't know if you've come across the Validity app, which is using, you know, beats to music to help you with your breathing and to improve your breathing, which is really interesting. Yeah.
There's just for those attendees with HRV, is for heart rate variability. The idea is that the heart is not a metronome. So if you measure your heart and your heart was like a metronome, would mean that you are about to die, basically. Means you are in a very toxic state, which normally leads to actually clinical death. So like a healthy heart is constantly dancing, you know, so every heartbeat is faster, slower, it just moves. And the analogy I actually explain or say to people is the analogy of the boxer. Like a boxer on the ring is constantly jumping back and forth. Why he's doing that? Because if he moves, he's got momentum to attack or momentum to react to an attack. Yeah. If he was standing still, he'd be a sitting duck. Yeah. So it'd be very hard for him to react. So the heart does that automatically. So if suddenly there's a predator behind me and my autonomic nervous system have to move from parasympathetic to sympathetic and my heart rate have to move from 60 to 180 in no time, it has that momentum to do so. That makes me much more resilient to stress. And that example I gave you was short-term stress. but ultimately also makes more resilient to long-term stress or chronic stress, which is the big disease of our time. So our experiments were aimed at that, how we can actually prime, basically how we can train the boxer, how we can actually get the boxer fit again, because HRV, when you are born, it's really wide and it's high. And as we age, it just shrinks slowly. And especially with disease and stress, it just even goes down in more acute spaces, even though it's a parameter which is also very intrapersonal. So it's not really good to compare your HRV with my HRV. So we always compare within the same person, because different people, we have different values and some can be healthy as well. So the idea of, okay, we all need to target for a certain amount of HRV is not correct. It's a very intrapersonal parameter.
So is it a case then, so the research, do you think one of the applications is this ability to reset the body's ability to rebound, I guess, and be more resilient?
You can do that through breathing. So these apps work there's one way to do it. So HRV is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which means that we have no conscious control over it. But there's a biohack you can do to control HRV, which is through the barrel reflex, which is this mechanism that controls blood pressure. So if I stand up and suddenly my blood pressure goes up, my brain will activate mechanisms to dilate my blood vessels and to lower heart rate, so blood pressure goes down. So it's a mechanism to basically balance. It works very well. And this mechanism has a resonance frequency, which is 0.1 hertz. And this resonance frequency, that's why when you breathe at the pace of 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, you are actually, because breathing activates the barrel reflex, you're actually doing so. So breathing at 5 seconds in, out is a great way, actually, deep breathing, to activate, to basically get the boxer to actually give him like a workout, So all these apps in the market are designed using breathing, basically. It's the only method that we know now that actually works to activate the barrel reflex and to get HRV into resonance is through resonant breathing. So we are exploring different ways, which were found by accident by a scientist called Basilo, that he was working using resonant emotional stimulation, which is you stimulate a patient or a participant with highly charged images, which creates an emotional response on that particular participant. If the frequency of this emotional stimulation is 0.1 hertz, you have the same effect. Not as strong as in breathing, but the same effect. So my research is trying to prove, well, if we take sound instead of images to do so, can we achieve the same result? Because of course sound, for these experiments, participants have to be looking at the screen to do so. So sounds, you can do it, for example, in an office or in public transport or in hotels, for example, So when people are just being, you could have the sounds would actually train their HRV even without them having to do anything, because the body already entrains with that without them having to consciously do anything.
Exactly. Really interesting. So the other thing before we move on to Yukari is just a question now. Of course, when I first got to know you a bit better, I watched this beautiful triptych that you had produced, which was sort of, I guess, challenging ideas at the time about what longevity is, which at the time was very much rooted into like radical life extension, living forever, which is still obviously the ambition of a lot of, people who are, including in Viva City, et cetera, et cetera. But I think interestingly, you were challenging, well, really, what are we really looking for, as the meaning of our lives? And I think entering that whole kind of spiritual zone. So just a little bit about that, because the whole point about connectivity and connecting people, which is where music has such an important job. A little bit more on that.
And I think Steph pointed to that earlier. Sometimes time is relative, we know that, and the longevity, I think there's an obsession with numbers, right, to achieve a longer life. But I think the main concern is having a full life, being present. And when you are really present and you feel very well, then it doesn't really matter, the number, because you could live to 100 and be unhappy and miserable. What's the point? But you are referring to a part of my life, and and that's going back to my artistic practice. I've always looked at the relationships between humanity and technology. And my first large-scale piece was Life from Light, in which I explored our relationship with nature. And the one you are referring to was exploring our relationship with death, taking into consideration the theories of singularity pioneered by Ray Kurzweil, which they promise that by 2045, when we reach this point of singularity, we can really become immortal. We become half hybrids of cyborgs and humans, so we can prolong life indefinitely. So there's all this push to be eternal. And then I was going through depression at the time, actually. That's why I was exploring the idea of death, because I thought, okay, sometimes at those moments you ask these big questions, right, about life and death. And I started exploring a lot of near-death experiences, actually, of people. And there's so much evidence out there. And from eminent figures from Harvard neuroscientists, that actually happened to them. So there's so much evidence. And I started exploring near-death experiences. And through that, you really realize that really death is not the end. Really. Death is just the end of a chapter where your spiritual body has a physical experience, but it's not the end of you. And if you bring, so that particular piece was bringing this Western perspective of our obsession for, to be eternal. And if you look back at culture, in Western culture, it's been a constant. A lot of artists from the past 2,000 years have been always trying to find this immortality. It's been like a quest, like a bit of a holy grail. But then when you bring in all the Eastern philosophies, that they tell you actually there's a purpose to dying. There's a purpose to being born, and there's a purpose to dying. And actually dying is what gives life purpose, actually. It's the whole point, actually, is that so I think, and when you look at nature, and sometimes we see ourselves as separate as nature, and that's a big mistake. Nature as a whole, things are born, have a life cycle, and they die, and they are reborn in new forms. So I think and that links possibly going back to the beginning of my conversation, this idea of this fear of death and fear of trying to live forever stems from a complete disconnection from your true essence, which is immortal, and then you live in fear, complete fear. So in that piece, I was posing the question of actually, what if there's something else, what if possibly, longevity has a role of whatever years are good for you to live them with maximum vitality, maximum happiness, maximum connection. And sorry.
This is a perfect, what you say is absolutely so important, actually. And it really is about the joy of living being the biggest motivator known to man, the joy of living rather than the fear of death. And I think that is a really interesting segue, actually, to Yukari, who I want to bring on, who, of course, there's the beauty of life and all of its chaos and serendipity and, creativity, where we meet people who are part of that journey that we're all on, which creates that joy. So I'm going to bring Yukari on, who's going to basically tell the story from her perspective of Longevity Rave, because as you both know, we both are, Longevity Rave, I guess, so to speak, bringing in many other people in this journey with us. But over to you, Yukari, and we were obviously, gigging last night together, and so I just want, it's over to you. The floor is yours. How did it all begin?
Thank you. Yeah. Before I get into that, I think I would like to share how I developed my passion for music and why raving is so important to me, and it's such a big part of my life. And it's not just about partying, people getting, and it is certainly part of that, but a lot of it has to do with connection and joy, as we were discussing throughout this session. So I think a big part of why music and raving is so important to me is because it's a community, and it makes me feel, or it makes people feel like they're part of something bigger. I think throughout human history, anthropologically, humans have collectively enjoyed music for centuries, and music has been bringing lots of people together, and there's a communal power that it holds. And for me, I was suffering
from some mental health problems throughout my youth. I was moving around a lot of the time. I had I really lacked a sense of belonging, and I was extremely lonely. But I always really enjoyed music, and that was one thing that always that brought me joy, and that made me happy. But I didn't really know how to express it, nor did I have a community to express it. And so when I was going through those struggles, and I was in London, I think randomly I went to a techno rave that my friend was saying you should come, and I just found myself to be in this space where people were just dancing and expressing themselves, and it didn't matter who you were, what language you spoke, what it looked like at that point in time. You just had to be in that space and enjoy the music, and you see people form just a dance circle and enjoy the music, and they're sweating, and I think that kind of euphoria really resonated with me, and I continued to go to these events, and I think it really made me feel out of my shell as well. Not only did I meet a lot of people and obviously my friends that had a sense of belonging, but personally I felt like I could express myself in a different way that I couldn't express in my normal life. I felt very in touch with just my passions, my human side, my sexuality. I think all of these things that you tend to kind of forget when you're living life, and you're focused on whether that's financially or education or those kind of hard things that life kind of forces you to focus on, and you ignore all of the other things that make that are important, and again brings you joy. And I think certainly in my there's a